The night opens softly, like the hush that follows a curtain drawing closed, and you drift into a world for 1,000 years behind you. The Nile is quiet tonight. You stand near its slow, mirror-like surface, watching papyrus reeds tilt lazily in the faintest breeze. The air smells faintly of mud, date wine, and something sweeter, a perfume perhaps, drifting from a nearby courtyard. You probably won't make it through this day. That's fine. You don't need to. This is ancient Egypt, somewhere around 1450 BCE, give or take a dynasty. You find yourself in Thebes, though no one calls it that, yet they call it Wasit, the city of the scepter. It doesn't feel like a bustling city right now. It feels like a dream stitched together from sand, stone, and river mist. People walk barefoot along packed earth paths, the soles of their feet calloused enough to make you question the need for sandals at all. A stray cat slips between mud brick walls, glancing back at you briefly, as if sizing you up for divine judgment. The world hums softly here. The creak of wooden water wheels, the rhythmic flap of linen drying on rooftop lines, and the faint buzzing of insects that have somehow survived longer than most empires. A slow barge moves along the river, heavy with bundles of blue lotus flowers, their petals used in rituals, perfumes, and allegedly certain parties where intense relaxation was encouraged. Historians still debate whether those parties were solemn spiritual affairs or the equivalent of a badly moderated group chat. Somewhere nearby, you hear laughter, a low, hushed sound, like gossip you're not supposed to overhear, but absolutely will. You follow the sound down a narrow alley until you reach a small perfumery. This is where the story begins. Inside, a man named Senatip bends over a clay bowl, grinding resin into powder with a stone pestle. Senatip is not a priest, not a noble, not anyone history books bother with. He makes perfume, but not for you, and certainly not for the living. He works for the dead. His shop is dim, lit by a single oil lamp that sputters as though running out of patience. The air is thick with layers of scent. Honey, myrrh, frankincense, something you can't quite name, but feels ancient, as if the desert itself has a smell. Senatip moves slowly, deliberately, as though the act of making perfume is less craft and more incantation. Every grain of resin, every droplet of oil is measured with reverence. In his world, fragrance is survival. A single amphora stands against the wall, sealed tightly with beeswax. On its surface, carved with deliberate care, are the words, "For the Ka of Hatshepsut." The Ka, of course, is the soul, the part of you that lingers when your body does not. You realize this bottle, when finished, will be carried into a tomb beneath a mountain of stone. It will be buried alongside a queen who believed she could outlast time itself, and in a way, she has. Outside, a priest passes by humming a hymn to Amen, and you catch just a fragment of the melody before it dissolves into the warm air. Somewhere in the distance, someone is pounding grain with a wooden mallet, and you can almost feel the rhythm in your chest. Even here, where pyramids cast their long shadows and gods whisper in incense smoke, people still argue about grain prices, trip over their own sandals, and complain about the heat. Some things never change. If you're awake enough to hear me, gently tap the like button. And if you want to wander further into this ancient evening, subscribe for more stories. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Imagine thousands of us drifting across time together. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. You step closer to Senatip's table, watching his hands move as if he's memorized this dance over 100 lifetimes. He reaches for a small jar of blue lotus oil, tipping just one drop into the mixture. The smell blooms instantly, rich and sweet, wrapping itself around you like silk. Senatip sighs, muttering under his breath, "One wrong ratio, and the Ka will be offended." He does not look up. He doesn't need to. He knows the recipe has been passed down through generations, guarded like a secret code. Scholars in your own time will find fragments of these formulas on papyrus scrolls and debate endlessly whether the instructions are accurate or symbolic. Some claim the recipes were more like poetry than chemistry, though. To be fair, if your perfume explodes, it might as well be art. As you watch, a tiny scarab beetle crawls lazily across the rim of the mixing bowl, pauses, and then disappears into a crack in the table. It seems even insects here understand the weight of eternity. You breathe deeply, letting the layered aromas settle around you, and for just a moment, time feels suspended. But then the shouting begins. Somewhere outside, someone is arguing something about taxes, or maybe stolen cattle, or possibly both. You lean against the cool mud brick wall, wondering if anyone in history has ever liked paying taxes. The answer, surprisingly, is no. Senatip barely reacts, continues grinding, murmuring to himself, "Perfume for the gods. Perfume for the dead. Perfume for the living who pretend to be dead." You're not sure whether that last part is a joke or a confession, but either way, you decide not to ask. The oil lamp flickers, the night deepens, you feel your shoulders soften, the river hums. And far above, the stars over Wasit look down with the same expression they've worn for millennia, faintly amused, endlessly patient. You wake, or maybe you never slept. The same lamp still burns, smaller now, its wick collapsing into a tiny pool of oil. Senatip hasn't moved much. Its pestle still turns in slow, hypnotic circles. Time here drips like honey from a broken jar, but outside, the city stirs. The first light brushes the Nile with threads of gold, and the air smells faintly of wet clay, fish, and smoke from breakfast fires. Somewhere, a rooster complains loudly about existence, which feels like an eternal constant across civilizations. Senatip sets aside the bowl and unwraps a bundle of dried herbs henna leaves, coriander, and something sharp and resinous you can't name. He leans close to inhale their scent, nods once, and whispers, "This one is for eternity." His voice is quiet, almost reverent, as though he's speaking to someone unseen. You wonder if he is. There's a scroll beside him, rolled tight and bound with linen cord. You edge closer, trying not to disturb him, and notice faint markings in faded red ink. The words are ancient, even for this time. Instructions from temple scribes on the making of kifia, sacred incense burned in rituals, offerings, and apparently bedtime relaxation sessions. One surviving recipe, copied centuries later, lists 16 ingredients, including raisins, honey, wine, and myrrh. Historians still debate whether it was actually burned, eaten, or both. If it was edible, it might explain why half the priests seemed permanently serene. Senatip begins heating the mixture over a clay brazier, and a sweet, smoky perfume unfurls through the room, curling like pale ribbons, clings to your skin, settles in your hair, and lingers in your lungs. It feels ancient, like breathing in the idea of memory itself. He glances up at you for the first time and raises an eyebrow, as if to say, "Still here? Aye." He gestures toward a small clay cup on the table. Inside is a liquid the color of desert amber. He doesn't explain what it is, and you decide, wisely, not to ask. You sip. It tastes like honey, figs, and wade. Possibly regret. Down the street, a group of women gather around a low table, weaving papyrus mats while exchanging quiet jokes. You catch fragments of conversation. Someone's neighbor borrowed an amphora and forgot to return it. Someone else complains about their husband's late-night fishing trips. One woman mutters that the priest at Karnak smells like onions and arrogance. The laughter that follows carries easily through the dry morning air. Daily life, it turns out, is mostly the same across 3,500 years. People gossip, people sigh, people spill wine and pretend they didn't. Remember that stray cat from earlier? It returns, padding silently through the doorway, tail high like it owns the place. Senatip doesn't glance up but mutters, "Guard the perfume or leave." The cat, naturally, does neither. Outside, barges glide past, loaded with alabaster jars, rolls of linen, and baskets of dates. The riverbank is alive now, the shouts of traders, the rhythmic splash of oars, the creak of ropes tightening against wooden posts. Somewhere beyond the bustle, you hear temple bells ringing, summoning priests to morning offerings. Senatip sighs deeply and ties a strip of linen around the amphora he sealed last night. "For Hatshepsut," he murmurs, tracing the carved symbols with his fingertip. "She'll want this one." You ask softly whether he's ever met her. He shakes his head, smiles faintly, and says, "No. But the dead have their ways of introducing themselves." You decide not to unpack that sentence right now. Little girl appears at the doorway, no older than 8, clutching a clay jug. She waits silently until Senatip hands her a small pouch. She tucks it under her arm and scampers away, barefoot, vanishing into the sunlit street. You ask who she was? Sinichep shrugs. Messenger for the House of Life, he says casually, as though that explains everything. The House of Life, you later learn, is a temple library, a place where knowledge itself is treated like a living thing. Papyrus scrolls whisper secrets there that even pharaohs aren't allowed to read. The lamp finally dies, leaving only daylight spilling through the doorway. The shadows shift across the table, slow and deliberate, like the turning of some immense celestial clock. You step outside for the first time since arriving, blinking against the light. Waste set stretches before you, endless and sun-drenched, the streets alive with quiet chaos. A boy chases a hoop down a narrow alley. A woman haggles with a fisherman over the price of tilapia. A scribe squats under an awning, balancing a reed pen between his fingers as he scratches receipts onto papyrus. And somewhere far beyond, carved deep into limestone cliffs, the tombs wait. You can almost feel the weight of stone and silence pressing against the desert horizon, as if the entire city is built on borrowed time. You breathe deeply, letting the mingled scents of river water, incense, and dust settle into your lungs. The day has begun, slowly, inevitably, like the soft swing of a pendulum. The cat follows you into the street, of course. The day stretches wider now, like linen laid out beneath the sun. And you follow the narrow street deeper into Waysit. The perfumery is behind you, though the faint sweetness of Sinetip's work still clings to your clothes, a quiet reminder that not everything here was built for the living. The street is busy, but unhurried, as though the city understands time differently than you do. A man carrying a basket of pomegranates moves aside for a group of temple scribes. Their white linen robes crisp and spotless despite the dust rising around their ankles. You try to figure out how they manage it. Maybe it's magic, or maybe it's laundry slaves, which is less poetic but more likely. To your left, two old men argue under the shade of a sycamore fig tree. They speak in quick, clipped phrases, hands flying in gestures sharp enough to cut air. You catch fragments, grain shipments, missing oxen, temple taxes. It sounds suspiciously like a city council meeting, except these men are barefoot and their minutes will never be recorded on papyrus. Somewhere behind you, a donkey brays loudly, clearly taking a side in the debate. A sudden breeze carries the faint smell of brewing beer, earthy and sour, from a nearby courtyard. Beer, you remember, isn't a luxury here, it's breakfast. The Egyptians drink it like water, partly because the Nile itself isn't exactly a trustworthy beverage source. It's thick, yeasty, and unfiltered, but it gets the job done. Historians still debate whether its popularity came from necessity or taste, though if you've ever tried ancient beer recipes, you might suspect necessity had the stronger case. You step into a shaded stall where a merchant sells small alabaster jars, their surfaces polished smooth as river stones. The merchant, an older woman with sun-darkened skin and gold rings stacked on her fingers, greets you warmly. Her voice is raspy, softened by years of bargaining. "You're late," she says, as though you've been buying perfume jars from her for a decade. You don't correct her. Hi. She lifts one jar and holds it up to the light. For incense, she explains, or oil, or secrets. Her smile is deliberate, as though she knows something about your evening plans that you don't. You buy nothing. It's mostly because you have no currency, and also because carrying extra jars while time traveling feels unnecessarily complicated, but you thank her anyway. Across the street, a group of temple singers gather, their long hair braided with beads and scented oils. They carry small sistro-musical rattles, shaped like horseshoes, and begin to chant a hymn to Hathor, goddess of music, love, and perfumes. The melody floats above the chatter of the marketplace, soft and luminous, weaving into the hum of daily life until it feels like the city itself is breathing in rhythm. The cat appears again, stalking your ankles like a self-appointed tour guide. You decide not to name it, though a small part of you suspects it already has a dozen divine titles and possibly a minor cult following. Remember the amphora Senatip sealed for Hatshepsut? One of the temple singers gestures toward the western cliffs, where the queen's mortuary temple rises against the desert like a staircase carved from sunlight. You catch only a glimpse through the haze, but the structure is impossible to mistake terraces stacked perfectly, columns standing in disciplined silence, as though the mountain itself bowed politely to make room for her ambitions. Built for the gods, the singer murmurs, almost to herself. Then after a pause, she adds, or to compete with them. Historians still debate whether Hatshepsut's temple was designed primarily for worship or for politics. Some argue it was a love letter to Amun, the god she claimed as her father. Others think it was a power move disguised as piety, a subtle way of saying, "Look upon my works, and kindly note that I am better than all of you." The sun climbs higher, heat pools in the streets, and people retreat beneath awnings, strung with woven reeds. You follow the flow, stepping into the shade of a long colonnade where scribes work cross-legged on low stools, their reed pens whispering across papyrus. One of them pauses to fan himself lazily with a scrap of broken pottery. You glance at his work. Numbers carefully drawn in neat rows, tallying grain, cattle, and perfume deliveries to various temples. The columns are exact, precise, relentless. You remember Senatip muttering last night about perfume for the living who pretend to be dead? Suddenly the joke makes sense. Someone calls your name, or at least it sounds like your name, and you turn to see Senatip leaning against a column, arms crossed, his expression hovering between amusement and mild annoyance. "You wander," he says, shaking his head, though his tone suggests he's not surprised. "Come, I need help." You hesitate, but follow, the cat padding behind as though this was its plan all along. Senatip leads you through winding alleys until you reach a small courtyard tucked behind mud-brick walls. Inside, several clay jars lie scattered across the ground, some broken, their contents staining the sand with dark, sticky patches. The air is heavy with the scent of spilled oils and something sharper, pine resin maybe. Senit gestures to the mess and sighs. "A delivery overturned," he explains, crouching to inspect the jars. "We needed this batch for the House of Life. Without it," he trails off, waving vaguely toward the horizon, where the temple libraries hide their secrets. You help him salvage what you can, gathering unbroken jars and brushing sand from their sides. The sun beats down overhead, but in the courtyard's quiet, time slows again, each breath drawn like thread through a loom. Finally, Senatip straightens, wiping his hands on a strip of linen. "Enough for now," he murmurs. Then, softer, almost to himself, "but not enough for eternity." The words linger in the air longer than they should. Afternoon spills slowly across Wasit, the heat settling like a heavy cloak, pressing the city into a collective drowsiness. Shadows shorten, voices quiet. Somewhere nearby, a lullaby drifts from an open doorway, soft as dust and twice as ancient. Senatip sits cross-legged beneath a woven canopy, his mixing bowl balanced carefully on his knees. He grinds resin again, slower this time, each motion deliberate, meditative. You sit across from him, half in sunlight, half in shade, feeling the strange calm that settles in when time itself forgets to rush. The cat naps between you, curled into a perfect spiral, tail twitching faintly as though dreaming of divine hunts. You wonder briefly whether cats here dream of gods or as gods. Scholars still debate the specifics. A faint clatter interrupts the quiet. You glance up to see a young apprentice, barely old enough to be trusted with clay, let alone secrets, carrying a stack of reed baskets taller than himself. He wobbles dangerously before disappearing into the workshop, muttering something about Horus testing his patience. You decide not to follow. Senatip taps the rim of the bowl thoughtfully. "Perfume," he says, "is memory," explains, without looking up. That certain scents are chosen not for their beauty, but for their ability to bind the Katha soul to its resting place. Frankincense to invite the gods. Myrrh to soothe the journey. Lotus oil to ease the passage into dreams. He pauses, holding up a small vial filled with pale green liquid. "This," he says softly, "is the secret." It doesn't elaborate, which feels both mysterious and deeply unfair. Somewhere in the distance, a temple drum sounds 3 slow beats, marking the afternoon ritual. You close your eyes, letting the rhythm settle into you, steady and deep. It feels as though the entire city breathes in unison for a moment. Scribes, priests, perfumers, fishermen, stray cats all, suspended in the same sunlit pause. When you open your eyes again, Senatip is gone. You glance around, startled, until you spot him standing at the edge of the courtyard, speaking quietly with a woman draped in fine linen. Her jewelry catches the light, a gold collar, polished carnelian beads, and a single lapis amulet carved in the shape of an egg. She listens intently, nodding once before placing a sealed scroll into his hands. He returns to you silently, slipping the scroll into a carved wooden chest. "From the House of Life," he explains, his voice low, almost reverent. "A new formula, older than the pyramids." You ask what makes it different? Senatep smiles faintly, shaking his head. "Some secrets," he says, "are written in smoke, not ink." By now, the street outside hums again, the city waking from its midday trance. Children chase hoops through the alleys. Traders call out their prices in melodic cadences, and somewhere nearby, an argument erupts over a misplaced goat. You wonder whether future historians will ever catalog the great goat disputes of Waysat. Probably not. Senutip packs the rescued jars into a reed basket, securing them with strips of linen. He gestures for you to follow him once more. You trail behind, weaving through crowds until the city opens into a wide plaza, framed by towering columns. At its center stands a shrine to Hathor, painted in blues and golds so vivid they seem to hum in the sunlight. Priests in white linen tend the shrine, their foreheads dotted with oil, their hands moving in precise, practiced gestures. They burn incense here, not ordinary incense, but the kind Senatip whispered about earlier, the kind that blurs the line between memory and eternity. The smoke curls upward, thick and fragrant, carrying offerings of scent to unseen realms. One priest turns toward you and gestures, beckoning you closer. You hesitate, but step forward. He dips a reed brush into a shallow bowl and draws a faint line of oil across your wrist. It smells of lotus and cinnamon, and something you can name, but know you've smelled before. Somewhere far away, in another life. Protection, the priest murmurs, then returns to his work as though nothing extraordinary has happened. Senatip watches you carefully, his expression unreadable. "Right. You'll need it," he says simply, before turning back toward the perfumery. As the sun slides lower, shadows stretch across the plaza, and the air cools enough to make the skin along your arms prickle. The Nile gleams like molten bronze beneath the fading light and beyond the river. The western cliffs stand silent, their tombs waiting in patient darkness. You glance down at your wrist, inhaling the faint trace of perfume there. It smells like something you can't quite hold, half memory, half promise. And somehow, you know the night ahead will not let you rest. Evening begins its slow descent, and the city of Wasat exhales. Air softens, the sun melts into amber light. Then the Nile takes on a molten sheen, as though someone spilled a jar of gold across its surface. You stand at the edge of the riverbank, your toes digging into damp earth, feeling the warmth fading from the day. Senatip is beside you, basket of salvaged jars balanced on his hip, staring across the water toward the western cliffs. His gaze lingers there, where the tombs rest, sealed in silence. He doesn't speak for a long time, but when he finally does, his voice sounds distant, almost carried by the river breeze. They say, he begins, that if the Ka cannot find its way home, it wanders. The statement hangs between you, fragile and uncomfortably plausible. Ka, the eternal double, the piece of the soul tethered to offerings and memory, it depends on careful ritual. Without perfume, without incense, without the proper formulas, eternity gets messy. And eternity, you realize, is already complicated enough. A small boat drifts past, its decks stacked with woven reed baskets. Inside them are pale lotus buds, wrapped carefully in damp linen, destined for temple altars or parties. Ancient Egypt had its share of both. Historians still debate whether blue lotus flowers were genuinely sacred or just an early excuse for mild hallucinogens at upper-class gatherings. Either way, the blossoms float through both ritual and rumor, like soft-spoken conspirators. Behind you, the sounds of Wasit fade into evening patterns, the slap of laundry against stone basins. Low conversations over dinner fires, the faint thump of a drum somewhere in the distance. The air grows cooler, carrying scents of grilled fish, coriander, and smoke. Senatep finally shoulders the basket and nods for you to follow. "We need to deliver the jars before nightfall," he says, his voice quieter now, as though the dark carries ears. You weave through the narrowing streets, their mud brick walls radiating stored heat. Oil lamps flicker from narrow windows, casting restless shadows across the path. Somewhere, a woman sings softly while grinding grain, the rhythm of stone on stone matching the cadence of her melody. As you turn a corner, the familiar stray cat darts ahead of you, tail upright, leading the way with an air of divine authority. You're starting to suspect the cat knows more than Senatip. At the edge of the city, the landscape opens into cultivated fields divided by irrigation channels that glitter under the fading sun. A small shrine stands here, almost hidden among papyrus reeds, its walls etched with faint hieroglyphs worn smooth by time. Senatip kneels briefly before it, touching his fingers to the stone, though you notice he doesn't actually whisper a prayer. You ask him why? He shrugs, not looking at you. The gods already know what I want. The sky deepens into shades of copper and indigo, and the first stars emerge faintly overhead. Senatip leads you along a narrow path toward the House of Life, the great temple library he mentioned before. Its outer walls rise in silence, towering and pale against the darkening sky. Each stone fitted so perfectly it feels like the building was carved from a single piece of light. You expect chanting, or at least the murmurs of scribes, but the courtyard is silent. 2 guards lean against spears at the entrance, nodding once at Senatip before stepping aside. Inside, the air changes. It's cooler here, filtered through dampened linen curtains, carrying the faint smell of ink, cedar oil, and age. Stacks of papyrus scrolls line the walls, wrapped in linen strips, labeled in careful red script. A single oil lamp illuminates a scribe bent over a low desk, reed pen scratching steadily across smooth fibers. Pause, watching the ink bloom in dark strokes, wondering how many voices are preserved here, layered on top of one another like pressed petals. Senatip delivers the basket to a waiting priest, who inspects the jars with a nod of approval before disappearing into a deeper chamber. When Senatip turns back, his expression is softened. "Come," he says quietly. "I'll show you something." Leads you down a side corridor, its walls painted with faded murals, scenes of boats sailing across starry skies, women scattering incense, and kings offering jars of perfume to gods who barely seem to notice. At the end of the corridor, there's a small alcove, unlit and hidden from view. Inside sits a single amphora, larger than the others, its surface carved with spiraling patterns that seem to move if you stare too long. Senatip kneels before it, touching the cool clay with his fingertips. "This one," he whispers, "is for the pharaoh's dream chamber." You ask gently what that means. He hesitates, glances toward the shadows, and says only, "Not every prayer is meant to be heard." Outside, the night deepens. Single breeze slips through the stone doorway, carrying the faint smell of blue lotus and smoke. Somewhere above, the stars sharpen, endless and unblinking, as if they too are keeping watch. The House of Life feels different at night. The air carries a hush, a weight, as though even sound hesitates here. You walk softly, your steps muffled against cool limestone, following Senatip deeper into the temple. Shadows pool along the corridor edges, swallowing murals and flickering lamplight into fragments. Somewhere far away, a single priest chants a low hymn, his voice vibrating through the stone like a pulse. It's not loud, but you feel it in your chest, steady and slow. The words are ancient, maybe older than the walls themselves, calling on gods whose names are rarely spoken aloud. Senatip leads you to a chamber lined with shelves stacked high with clay jars and bundled herbs, some so old their labels have faded to pale scratches. He picks up a small amphora and removes the wax seal carefully, holding it beneath your nose. The scent is sharp and clean, almost metallic, like crushed cedar and river stones after rain. "Kiffy," he says softly, though the formula is different from the one you saw earlier. "This blend isn't for offerings, it's for sleep." You raise an eyebrow. Senatip smiles faintly. For the pharaoh, he clarifies, dreams need tending too. According to temple records, pharaohs often performed elaborate rituals before sleep, invoking the gods to send visions of guidance, reassurance, or prophecy. The incense burned in these chambers was carefully chosen to open the mind without unbinding the soul. Historians still debate whether these visions were divine messages or simply what happens when you fall asleep in a room. Full of fragrant smoke after an oversized dinner, Senatip begins preparing a fresh mixture, crushing dried figs, resin, and cinnamon, together with a smooth stone humming under his breath. The rhythm is slow, steady, hypnotic, like the Nile itself flowing past. We watch his hands move with practiced certainty, each gesture balanced between craft and ritual. From somewhere nearby, you hear soft footsteps. A scribe emerges from the shadows, carrying a tightly bound scroll. He looks young, too young to be here at this hour, and his wide eyes suggest he knows it. He whispers something quickly to Senatip, placing the scroll in his hands before darting away, vanishing back into the maze of corridors. Senatip doesn't open it immediately. He just stares at the sealed papyrus, thumb grazing the knot, until he finally exhales and tucks it beneath his sash. "Trouble, you ask quietly?" "Only if anyone notices," he replies, which is neither reassuring nor clarifying. You decide to let the silence hold. Somewhere above you, a breeze stirs through high vents, carrying faint traces of incense from another chamber. The air tastes of lotus and honey, and the suggestion of rain, hasn't tea fallen here in months. Remember the amphora meant for Hatshepsut? You think of it now, buried in a hidden chamber beneath the cliffs, sealed for eternity? The connection feels fragile, like a thread pulled across time. But somehow, you sense these recipes, these jars, these scents are all part of the same design. Perfume here is an indulgence. It's architecture, a bridge, a map. Senatip interrupts your thoughts by pressing a small clay cup into your hands. "Drink," he says simply. You hesitate, eyeing the amber liquid. "What is it?" "Patience," he replies, sipping his own. You drink. It's warm, thick, and sweet, with undertones of something floral and strange, like honey diluted with memory. A slow calm spreads through your chest, loosening your shoulders. Somewhere beyond the chamber, bells toll softly, marking the first watch of the night. The sound ripples through the temple like a long breath drawn and released. Senatip leans back against the stone wall, closing his eyes briefly. "Tomorrow," he says quietly, "we visit the western cliffs." You glance toward the darkness outside, where the tombs wade like silent mouths carved into the desert. The thought of entering them should unsettle you, but instead it feels inevitable, like stepping into a story that's been unfolding for millennia. The cat, of course, chooses this moment to appear, slipping through the doorway with silent paws, curling into your lap as though it's claimed you entirely. Stroke its fur absently, feeling the vibration of its purr against your palm, steady and grounding. Somewhere beyond these walls, the river whispers against its banks. The stars spread themselves across the velvet dark. And the city of Waysot sleeps uneasily, dreaming beneath the weight of gods and kings. You close your eyes just for a moment. The perfume burns low, the night deepens, and something waits for you in the cliffs. Dawn arrives softly, like a reed flute playing somewhere beneath your dreams. You wake to the faint smell of lotus oil still clinging to your wrist, and the weight of the cat curled in the crook of your arm, purring as though it's tuned to some ancient frequency. Outside, Waysot stretches and stirs beneath the first threads of sunlight, and the temple walls glow with pale gold. Senatip is already awake. Of course he is. He moves with quiet efficiency, packing reed baskets with small sealed amphorae, bundles of dried herbs, and a few tightly wrapped linen strips. When you ask where all this is going, he simply says, "To the cliffs." As though that explains everything, which in a way it does and doesn't. You leave the house of life together, stepping into streets already buzzing with morning sounds. A boy chases a runaway goat. A fishmonger argues with a baker about the price of barley bread. And someone nearby is loudly reciting a hymn to Amen, off-key, but committed. The city feels alive, but in a way that has nothing to do with speed. Here time is slower, circular, patient as the river itself. You notice the amphora Senatip carries at his side, the one meant for Hatshepsut's tomb. The carved spirals catch the morning light, and for a moment it almost seems to breathe. The journey to the western cliffs begins at the river. A low wooden boat waits, tethered to a smooth stone pier, its oars resting lazily in the morning current. The ferryman. It's an older man with sun-creased skin and an expression halfway between boredom and divine serenity, nods once without speaking as you step aboard. The cat follows, naturally, leaping onto the prow like it owns the Nile. The river crossing is slow and quiet. Papyrus reeds sway at the banks, their tips whispering secrets into the warm air. Birds skim the surface, breaking the mirror-like water with ripples that vanish almost instantly. You lean back against the boat's edge, watching the eastern city shrink into soft shapes. in the western cliffs rise like a wall of time itself. Senatip finally breaks the silence. The West, he says, belongs to the dead. It sounds ominous, but he says it casually, as though pointing out that the market closes early on festival days. You glance at the cliffs-layered limestone rising in pale. Sun-bleached terraces, their surfaces carved into tomb entrances and silent facades. He explains in his patient, understated way that the Egyptians believed the West was where the sun died each night, crossing into the unseen world. To be buried here, beneath this eternal horizon, is to follow Ra's journey through the Duat, the realm of spirits before, rising again in the morning. Historians still debate whether these beliefs were rigid doctrine or poetic metaphor. But here, floating on the slow Nile with stone gods staring down from the cliffs, metaphor feels unnecessary. You dock at a small landing and begin to climb along a winding path carved into the rock. The heat hasn't yet peaked, but the air here is dry and heavy, tasting faintly of dust and sunlight. The silence deepens with each step until the city's sounds vanish entirely, replaced by the soft crunch of sandals on stone. A small shrine stands halfway up the path, its walls etched with hieroglyphs faded almost to whispers. Senatip pauses here, placing a single drop of oil onto the carved surface, murmuring something too quiet to catch. The cat sits beside him, tail flicking, staring into the shrine's dark recess as though it sees something you don't. Higher still. The tomb entrances appeared, dozens of them, carved into the cliff face, their dark mouths gaping beneath lintels painted with faint remnants of blue and gold. Some are sealed. Others stand open, their thresholds shadowed and cool. You feel the weight of centuries pressing against you here, like walking through air that remembers too much. Senatip leads you past several narrow passages until you reach a larger doorway set deep into the rock. Its lintel bears Hatshepsut's name, carved boldly in raised relief, each symbol deliberate and certain. The amphora at his side seems heavier now, as though it recognizes where it belongs. A pair of workers sit outside, scraping sand from blocks of limestone, their faces sunburned and lined with sweat. One of them glances up briefly and mutters, "Keep your feet quiet in there." It sounds like advice or a warning, possibly both. Inside, the air changes instantly. It's cooler, still, almost damp, despite the desert outside. The flicker of an oil lamp reveals painted walls alive with scenes of offerings, lotus flowers, and gods with falcon heads and endless eyes. Time feels thick here, layered and slow, like honey settling at the bottom of a jar. Senatip sets the amphora down gently, pressing his palm against the carved spirals once before stepping back. He exhales softly, as though releasing something he's carried far too long. You want to ask questions, but the silence in this place feels sacred, and your voice stays caught in your throat. Somewhere deep in the tomb, beyond sight, you hear the faintest rustle, like linen shifting softly in unseen air. The cat stares into the dark, ears twitching. Senatip does not look up. You're standing inside a tomb built for eternity, but somehow it feels fragile. The air carries a faint sweetness, the lingering perfume of Kifi burned long ago, and a cool weight presses against your skin, as though stone remembers more than it should. Senatip moves carefully, lighting a small oil lamp and shielding the flame with his hand. Shadows ripple across the walls, illuminating painted scenes of processions. Offerings and golden barges sailing through star-strewn skies. You recognize Hatshepsut's figure immediately, tall and serene, depicted in masculine form, false beard, broad shoulders, the regalia of a pharaoh who dared to rewrite the rules of her own story. Historians still debate how she managed it, how a woman declared herself pharaoh, ruled for 2 decades, and built monuments that outlived dynasties. Some argue it was clever politics. Others point to her divine claims as Amon's daughter. But here, beneath the weight of stone, the debate feels irrelevant. Power echoes differently when carved into walls designed to last longer than memory. Senatip sets the amphora near a low altar, placing it carefully among other offerings, carved figurines, alabaster jars, and bundles of dried lotus wrapped in linen. He kneels briefly, resting his fingers on the cold stone, then rises without a word. Perfume, he murmurs finally, is the language the dead still understand. You follow him deeper into the chamber, your footsteps soft against the packed earth floor. The ceiling arch is low, painted with stars so bright they seem to flicker when the lamplight shifts. It's quiet here, but not empty. You can almost feel the hum of unseen currents moving through the space, as though the walls themselves breathe in time with you. The cat slips ahead, tail held high, disappearing briefly into a narrow side passage before returning, unbothered. You decide to interpret this as a good omen, though you're not sure the cat agrees. Senatip pauses at a carved panel depicting Anubis, jackal-headed and calm, hands outstretched over a mummy swaddled in linen. He traces the lines of the carving thoughtfully, saying, "Every scent matters. Myrrh to soothe, frankincense to purify, cedar to hold the ka in place." His tone is reverent, but also faintly practical, as though he's explaining furniture assembly instructions for eternity.
I'll wait.
A faint sound carries through the passage, a low, rhythmic beating, distant but steady. At first you think it's your own heartbeat, but Senatip tilts his head, listening closely. "Drums," he says finally. The priests above us, preparing the night rites. You imagine the world above, where the temple courtyards glow with firelight, and priests chant invocations beneath a rising moon. Here, beneath all that ceremony, it feels like you're standing between two currents, the living and the dead, the spoken and the remembered. Senatip leads you toward the back of the chamber, where a small recess in the wall holds several sealed amphorae. He points to one carved with a falcon motif, its beeswax seal unbroken. That, he says quietly, hasn't been opened in 300 years. You ask why, expecting an elaborate answer, but he just shrugs. Some scents aren't meant for the living. The cat brushes against your ankle, then sits, staring at the amphora, as if guarding it. You crouch to examine the faint markings on the clay, but Senatip gently touches your shoulder and shakes his head. Not tonight. You step back, letting the quiet settle again. The lamp flickers once, casting long, shifting shadows that seem to stretch farther than the room should allow. You try to slow your breathing, matching it to the measured hush of the chamber. But the air feels thicker here, heavier somehow. Finally, Senatip turns, gathering his tools and tucking a small bundle of herbs into his sash. "We've done enough," he says softly. The rest waits for the priests. You follow him back toward the entrance, the flicker of lamplight guiding your path through the painted halls. At the threshold, you pause, glancing once more into the chamber's depths. The silence there feels patient, like something that has waited a very long time and will continue waiting long after you leave. Outside, the night has fully arrived. The cliffs glow faintly beneath the starlight, and the Nile glimmers far below, black and endless. The air is cooler now, touched with the scent of lotus drifting from distant temple fires. Senatip says nothing as you begin the descent, but you notice his hand resting briefly on the amphora at his side, fingers grazing the carved spirals. There's something in his expression, a quiet understanding, perhaps or maybe just the weight of too many stories kept in jars. At the base of the cliffs, the ferryman waits silently by his boat, torchlight reflected in his dark, still eyes. Without speaking, you climb aboard. The cat leaps into your lap, curling against you as the oars dip into the river, pulling you back toward the sleeping city. You glance once over your shoulder, watching the cliffs recede into shadow. Something lingers there, unseen but listening. The boat glides silently across the Nile, the oars dipping into the black water with soft, steady strokes. Above you, the stars scatter across the sky like crushed alabaster, and the cool night air carries the faintest trace of incense from distant temple fires. The city of Waste waits on the eastern bank, Kay glowing faintly beneath its flickering oil lamps, while behind you, the western cliffs vanish into darkness, taking their secrets with them. Senatip sits opposite you, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his gaze fixed on the rippling surface. He hasn't spoken since leaving the tomb, and you sense that silence here carries meaning. There are places where words belong, and places where they don't, and the western necropolis seems firmly in the second category. The cat is draped across your lap like a small, purring sphinx, vibrating softly with contentment or, perhaps, warning. It occasionally lifts its head to glare at the river, then relaxes again, as though confirming that whatever lurks beneath isn't worth the trouble. Finally, as the boat nears the opposite bank, Senatip speaks. "We'll need more resin tomorrow," he says simply, his voice low, almost lost to the wind. "The priests want a new blend for the night rites." nod, though he doesn't seem to expect an answer. The boat docks, bumping gently against the pier, and the ferryman raises a hand in silent farewell. You climb the worn stone steps back into Wayside, where the city exhales into its nighttime rhythms. Lanterns glow faintly along narrow alleys, and soft laughter drifts from a courtyard where someone's late meal has turned into an impromptu gathering. You pass a row of small shrines tucked into mud brick walls, their niches filled with clay figurines, dried flowers, and bowls of offerings. Dates, bread, beer. One of the bowls holds a single pomegranate split open, its seeds glinting like garnet in the lamplight. You pause to look, but Senatip keeps walking. The dead, he says over his shoulder, are hungrier than we are. At first you think he's joking, but his tone is flat, unbothered, the kind of statement born from a culture that treats eternity like housekeeping. You follow him back toward the perfumery, its small doorway dimly lit by a single oil lamp. Inside, the air is thick and warm, carrying the mingled scents of honey, cedar, and smoke. Senatip sets the amphora down carefully, then lowers himself onto a reed mat with a sigh that sounds far older than he is. He gestures for you to sit, then begins unwrapping a small bundle of herbs tied with linen. Inside are delicate blue petals, dried lotus flowers, papery and pale in the lamplight. He holds one up between his fingers. Lotus, he explains softly, is the scent of forgetting. You ask what he means, but he doesn't answer right away. Instead, he places the petals into a small clay bowl and begins to crush them with a smooth pestle, releasing their faint sweetness into the air. When the ka travels, he says finally, it carries memories heavier than stone. Sometimes the dead need rest too. Historians in your time still debate whether blue lotus was used for ritual dreams, mild sedation, or something stranger altogether. Here, watching Senatip's hands move with careful reverence, you suspect the answer is yes to all three. The cat climbs onto the work table and begins pawing at a small jar of myrrh, threatening to knock it into eternity. Senatip scolds it gently, but makes no move to remove it, muttering under his breath, "Baste its spoiled child." Somewhere outside, a soft drumbeat starts up, slow and deliberate, carrying through the quiet streets. Senatip glances toward the door but doesn't rise. "Night rites," he murmurs. "They're calling the gods awake." The idea makes you glance instinctively toward the western cliffs, invisible now behind the city walls. You remember the sealed amphory in Hatshepsut's tomb, the carved falcon, and the quiet Senatip refused to break. The drumbeat deepens, joined by low chanting from somewhere far off. The words are carried by the warm night breeze, fragments dissolving before you can make sense of them. Senatip finishes crushing the petals and pours the powder into a small jar, sealing it with wax. He sets it aside carefully, as though the act itself completes something larger than the mixture it holds. Then he leans back against the wall, arms folded loosely, and says, "Tomorrow, we begin the hard work." You start to ask what that means, but he closes his eyes, ending the conversation before it begins. The cat curls beside him. The oil lamp burns low. Somewhere outside, the priests keep singing to gods who may or may not be listening. You wake before dawn, stirred by the faint rustle of linen and the low rhythmic pounding of something heavy against stone. A moment you think it's a dream, until you open your eyes and find Senatip, already awake, kneeling before a wooden chest, carefully wrapping bundles of herbs in strips of white cloth. "Come," he says quietly, without looking up. "Today we go to the river markets." Outside, the city still sleeps. The streets are hushed, painted in soft gray light, their shadows stretched long and cool. You walk past shuttered stalls and empty courtyards, following the faint sound of water wheels creaking somewhere in the distance. The river market wakes slowly, like an old man reluctant to leave his bed. Boats nudge against the docks, their hulls heavy with baskets of figs. Bundles of reeds, jars of beer, and crates of alabaster jars sealed with wax. Traders shout greetings to one another in voices still thick with sleep, while cats weave between baskets, stealing fish with unapologetic precision. Senatip moves through the stalls with quiet confidence, pausing to inspect a bundle of resin here, a jar of honey there, his fingers grazing the surfaces like a man reading by touch, finally stops at a narrow stall shaded by hanging strips of linen, where an older woman sits cross-legged, grinding something into fine powder. Without a word, she slides a small clay jar toward him. Senatip opens it, inhales deeply, and nods once. Pine resin, he explains softly to you. Sharp enough to cut through time. You glance at the resin pail. Translucent fragments like captured sunlight. Wonder if he's exaggerating. He isn't. The woman's stall holds more than resin. It's dried petals, chunks of amber, tiny amphorae, filled with thick oils, each labeled in careful red script. She hands Senatip a scroll without being asked, and he tucks it away without looking. You get the impression that much of this market operates on knowledge older than coin. Historians still debate how far these trade routes stretched, whether the pine came from distant Lebanon, whether cinnamon arrived from as far as India. Here, standing between the Nile and the desert, the boundaries blur. Scents travel farther than armies, it seems. Senatip finishes his purchases and gestures for you to follow him back toward the city, street basket now heavy with ingredients. Along the way, you pass a group of fishermen hauling their morning catch from the river. Their hands slick with scales and sunlight. One of them pauses to splash water at the cat trailing you, but the cat sidesteps elegantly, glaring as though he's insulted a minor deity. By the time you return to the perfumery, the city is fully awake. Children chase each other between mud brick walls. A scribe balances an entire stack of scrolls on one shoulder. Someone nearby shouts about a stolen amphora of beer. Inside, Senatip lays out his new ingredients on the table, arranging them with deliberate care. Today, he says, we prepare the blend for the dream rites. He begins measuring crushed frankincense, honey, and blue lotus powder into a shallow bronze bowl. Adding pine resin last, sprinkling it slowly like salt over water. The scent blooms instantly, sharp and bright, cutting through the heavy morning air. As he works, he explains that this blend isn't just incense and invitation. It's burned in the temples during night rituals. It calls the gods closer, coaxing them into the dreams of the pharaoh and priests alike. Some scents, he murmurs, are keys. You glance at the small sealed scroll he took from the market woman, still untouched beside the oil lamp. You want to ask what's inside, but you decide against it. There are moments when questions feel heavier than answers. The cat curls beneath the work table, tail twitching occasionally as if dreaming. Outside, the drums begin again, low and steady, marking the approach of evening rites. Senatip sets the finished mixture aside to dry, wiping his hands on a strip of linen. Then he turns to you, his expression unreadable. Tonight, he says softly, we watch the gods breathe. You're not entirely sure whether that's poetic or literal. You're even less sure you want to find out. Evening drapes itself over Wasit slowly, like linen settling across still water. The sun sinks beyond the horizon, spilling its last copper light onto the Nile, and the city exhales into quiet anticipation. The drums begin, again low, deliberate, unhurried as though summoning something older than memory. Senatip moves like the shadows themselves, gathering small bundles of herbs, jar of the new blend, and 2 fresh oil lamps. Tonight, he says softly, we go to Karnak. The cat naturally follows. You've stopped questioning its choices. The walk north takes you through narrow streets that wind like papyrus roots. The air is warm, but carries the promise of cooling, scented faintly with bread from an unseen oven. Lamps glow in recessed doorways, and voices drift softly from within stories' songs. Arguments about fish prices ordinary fragments of life, unbothered by the enormity of the gods nearby. When you reach Karnak's outer walls, the sheer scale steals your breath. Towering pylons rise against the starlit sky, their carved faces illuminated by hundreds of flickering torches. Shadows of colossal statues stretch across the courtyard, their stone forms half lost in darkness but undeniably watching. Senatip leads you past the outer colonnade, where rows of sandstone columns soar like petrified forests, their surfaces carved with hymns and offerings. You brush your fingertips across one column, feeling the grooves of hieroglyphs that have outlasted kings.
Ow.
Inside the great hypostyle hall, the air is cooler, filled with the low hum of voices, chanting somewhere beyond sight. Priests move like pale moths in the lamplight, their linen robes whispering with each step. One glances at you briefly, but says nothing. You're here under Senatip's shadow, and that seems to grant you invisibility. He sets his reed basket down before a small stone altar at the temple's edge. Carefully, he unseals the jar of the dream blend and begins to crumble fragments into a bronze censer. The resin catches quickly, its smoke spiraling upward in slow, translucent ribbons. The scent is unlike anything you've known, honeyed and sharp, sweet and dry, with an undercurrent of pine so deep it feels ancient. You inhale, and the edges of the world blur slightly, as though the air itself has grown thicker. "Don't breathe too much," Senitip murmurs dryly, without looking up. "Unless you want to start seeing crocodiles in the ceiling." You step back instinctively, and he almost smiles. The chanting grows louder now, swelling from the temple's central court. Priests move in a slow procession carrying a gilded bark, its wooden frame inlaid with ivory and obsidian, draped in lotus garlands that swayed with each step. Atop it sits a sealed shrine, veiled in linen Ammon's hidden presence passing through the night. You realize suddenly that you're re-witnessing something forbidden to most, the summoning of gods into the human realm. And yet no one here seems surprised. The divine and the mundane are stitched together seamlessly, like reeds woven into a single mat. Historians in your time still argue whether these rites were symbolic or literal invitations. But here, standing in the resin-scented haze, it feels like the question has no meaning. The god arrives because the smoke says so. Senitip gestures for you to sit near the column's base, out of the way, and you lower yourself onto the cool stone floor. The cat curls up against your side instantly, as though claiming this precise spot on behalf of Bastet herself. Then the drums stop. The silence that follows is immense, vibrating in your chest.
"Your priests kneel as one,"
bowing their foreheads to the polished floor. You glance at Senitip, but his eyes are half closed, his hands resting on his knees in quiet stillness. From somewhere deep within the sanctuary, a low, resonant note rises not sung, but felt like the deep hum of earth itself. The air trembles slightly, your skin prickles. Senitip leans close and whispers, almost soundless. Now they listen. You try to follow his gaze upward, past the towering columns, into the darkness above, but the incense catches in your lungs. And for a dizzy moment, the ceiling seems to ripple like water under moonlight. You blink hard, and the sensation passes, leaving only the cool solidity of stone. Senitip exhales slowly, almost like someone surfacing from deep water, and begins to gather his tools. "We've seen enough," he murmurs. Outside, the night feels different somehow. The stars are brighter, the air sharper, the Nile darker and quieter than before. You're not sure whether it's the incense, the ritual, or something deeper, but you do know this. Something stirred tonight, and hasn't quite settled back to sleep. You wake to sunlight cutting across the perfumery's wall in pale stripes. The distant shouts of traders already filling the streets. The cat sits on the windowsill, tail twitching like a metronome, watching pigeons scatter across the rooftops. Senitip is already working, of course, seated cross-legged on the reed mat, with a small bronze bowl balanced in his lap. He's mixing something thick and dark, the motion of his pestle steady and unhurried. "You slept through the second rite?" he says mildly, without looking up. You apologize automatically, though you're not entirely sure what you missed. "Don't worry," he adds, with just a trace of a smile. "The gods rarely notice." He gestures toward the bowl, and you lean closer. Inside is a mixture of ground cinnamon, honey, and something resinous you don't recognize. The scent is warm and deep, carrying a faint hint of spice that curls into the air like a question. "This," he says softly, "is for the pharaoh's dreams." He explains that tonight, the temple will burn this new blend beneath Hatshepsut's golden shrine, guiding her Ka toward visions deemed necessary for the kingdom's stability. You ask whether it works, whether the gods truly shape dreams this way, but Senitip only shrugs. Sometimes, he says, belief is stronger than truth. Historians still debate the role of ritual incense in ancient Egypt. Was it medicinal, symbolic, or meant to induce altered states? Here, watching Senitip's deliberate hands, it feels like all three at once. As he works, you notice the sealed scroll from the market still resting on the table, untouched since yesterday. Curiosity finally wins. "What's inside?" you ask. Senitip pauses, then sets the pestle down. He unrolls the scroll carefully, revealing neat lines of faded red ink. The script is old, older than you expected, and though you can't read it fully, you catch fragments, lists of names, offerings, instructions for preparing the scent of eternal breath. He traces one line with his finger. This formula, he says, was used only once at the burial of a king whose name no one speaks anymore. You ask why the secrecy, but Senatip only gives a small, dry laugh. Sometimes, sense open doors better left closed. Before you can press further, a knock sounds at the doorway. A young temple scribe enters, bowing quickly before handing Senatip a small alabaster jar sealed with wax. Senatip inspects it briefly, nods, and dismisses the boy with a soft word. He holds the jar up to the light, its pale surface glowing faintly. Imported myrrh, he says. Lebanon, probably. He taps the wax seal gently, almost reverently. One drop of this, he adds, and the QA finds its way home. You lean back, watching as he measures out a single glistening bead into the blend. The resin melts slowly, releasing a rich, deep aroma that seems to hang in the air like a memory you can't quite name. The cat stretches, yawns, and hops onto the work table, settling directly beside the bowl. Senatip sighs, but doesn't move it. Has chosen her apprentice, he mutters. By late afternoon, the blend is finished. Senatip transfers it into a small bronze censer, sealing it with linen and wax. He sets it aside gently, his shoulders relaxing for the first time all day. Tonight, he says, we burn this for Her Majesty. Outside, the drums begin again, distant but steady, calling the city toward the temple. And though the day has been ordinary, the air carries a quiet weight, like something unseen shifting just beneath the surface. You glance at the sealed scroll again, its faded ink, whispering secrets you're not yet ready to hear. Not yet. The sun is low when you leave the perfumery, and the city of Waysot glows in a soft amber haze. The Nile reflects streaks of fading gold, its surface smooth, except for the occasional ripple from a passing boat. People move deliberately now, slower than in the heat of the day, as though conserving energy for whatever the night may bring. Senatip walks beside you, carrying the bronze censer sealed in linen, his hand resting lightly on it, as though it holds more than just perfumed resin. The cat follows, weaving between your legs with the kind of precision only cats or small, mildly supernatural beings can manage. Tonight, Senatip murmurs, we burn the dream blend. The walk to Karnak feels different this time. There's a hum in the air, a current running through the streets, as though the entire city is aware of something about to unfold. Past families laying out small bowls of bread and figs on stone steps, murmuring short prayers to household gods. Children chase each other barefoot through alleys, while somewhere nearby a group of musicians tunes their flutes and sistrums. When you reach Karnak's towering gates, the pylons are washed in torchlight. The stone glows honey gold, and shadows of colossal statues stretch long across the courtyard. Senatip pauses for a moment, his gaze lifting to the carved figures of Aman and Mut high above. Their faces serene and unbothered, like beings accustomed to holding entire kingdoms in their stillness. Inside the temple, the air is dense with incense already burning sweet, sharp resinous layers intertwining until you can no longer separate them. Priests move like ghosts between towering columns, their linen robes catching the flicker of lamplight as chants swell and retreat in waves. Senatip finds a quiet alcove near the inner court and sets the bronze censer on a low stone platform. He unwraps it carefully, almost ceremoniously, revealing the blend inside. The mixture catches the light golden flecks among dark resin, a shimmer that feels somehow intentional, like a map written in scent. Watch, he says softly. He touches a lit taper to the blend, and at first nothing happens. Then the resin softens, darkens, and suddenly breathes a slow ribbon of smoke, rising in elegant spirals toward the ceiling lost in shadows above. The scent expands immediately: warm honey, sharp pine, a whisper of cinnamon, underpinned by something deeper. Darker, almost metallic, like rain on sun-baked stone. The chants shift, low and rhythmic, and a group of priests enters, carrying a small gilded shrine veiled in linen. Behind them, musicians follow, playing long, drawn-out notes on reed flutes, their melodies floating upward like weightless birds. The shrine is placed on a platform in the sanctuary center, and the veil is carefully lifted, revealing a statue of Hatshepsut as pharaoh. But as divine Ka, her carved face is serene, her eyes inlaid with obsidian, catching the lamplight so they seem to follow you. Senatip murmurs under his breath words you can't quite catch, and sprinkles a pinch of the blend into the censer. The smoke thickens, curling around the statue as if drawn toward it deliberately. Tonight, he whispers, she dreams through us. Historians still debate whether these rites were meant for the living or the dead, whether the ka of a pharaoh actively received these offerings, or whether the ritual was symbolic, binding the living ruler to divine authority. Here, beneath the weight of stone and scent, you feel no need to choose. It's both. It has to be. Then, without warning, the chanting stops. Silence falls heavy, sudden, absolute. The priests kneel, bowing low, their foreheads against the polished stone floor. Senatip does not move, his gaze fixed on the smoke rising between you and the statue. The air feels charged, vibrating faintly, as though something unseen has drawn close enough to listen. Somewhere deep within the temple, a single sistrum shaksa, soft, metallic rattle like wind stirring distant reeds. Almost Syntype leans close and whispers, almost soundless, breathe slowly. You do, but the incense carries you deeper. Blurring edges, softening thought, until even your heartbeat seems to sync with something outside yourself. The cat sits perfectly still, tail curled tightly, its ears twitching in minute movements as though following sounds you can't hear. When the chants return, they are slower, quieter, almost like a lullaby meant for gods and mortals alike. Senatip touches your arm lightly. It's done, he murmurs, and begins packing the empty censer. Outside the temple, the air is cool and clear, the stars sharp above, but the silence clings, following you back through Waysit's winding streets. Something happened tonight, something you can't name. The next morning, you wake to find Senatip already gone. The perfumery is quiet except for the rhythmic scratching of reeds. Outside, where a scribe is recording temple accounts on a fresh papyrus roll, sunlight filters through the open doorway, carrying the warm, dry scent of baking bread from somewhere nearby. On the work table, you find a small note weighted beneath a piece of limestone. Senatip's handwriting is careful but sparse. West Cliffs. Bring water. You sigh, glance at the cat who yawns, unimpressed. Gather what little shade you can manage beneath a reed hat before stepping back into the city. Waysot is already alive despite the early hour. Merchants haggle over linen prices. Fishermen unload their morning catch. And a procession of apprentices carries amphorae of honey up toward Karnak. A boy nearly runs into you carrying a clay pot twice his size, apologizing breathlessly before darting off. The path west leads you once again toward the river and the small wooden ferry, waiting patiently at the dock. The ferryman nods wordlessly, recognizing you now. You set off across the Nile, its surface smooth as hammered bronze beneath the rising sun. On the western bank, the climb begins. The cliffs loom pale and immense, riddled with tomb entrances like doorways into silence itself. You spot Sanit halfway up the path, crouched beside a small shrine carved directly into the rock. He's carefully grinding something against a flat stone surface, pausing occasionally to pour a few drops of oil from a tiny flask. You're late, he says mildly, without looking up. I brought water, you counter, and hand him the jar. He accepts it with a nod, drinks deeply, then gestures toward the grinding slab. Frankincense, he explains. We're testing a new blend for the burial chamber. The words burial chamber hang in the air longer than they should. Senatip notices your hesitation and offers a faint, knowing smile. Don't worry, he says dryly. We're not the ones being buried. You're not entirely reassured. He finishes grinding the resin into a fine, pale powder and mixes it with crushed juniper berries, lotus petals, and a touch of myrrh. The scent rises immediately, soft and sweet, almost cooling despite the sun. He dips a linen wick into the mixture, then lights it carefully, holding it beneath the shadowed entrance of a nearby tomb. Smell that? He asks. You nod. It's delicate, floral, almost ghostly-like memory distilled into air. That Senatip says softly is for the Ka to find its way. Historians still debate how Egyptians understood the Qa, whether it was soul, life force, or something stranger. Here, standing on sun-bleached stone with incense curling into the cool darkness of a tomb, you realize the distinction probably didn't matter. What mattered was guiding what remained where it needed to go. As the incense burns low, Senatip carefully seals the remaining mixture into a small clay jar, marking its surface with a stylized lotus symbol. That one, he says, is for the queen herself. You remember the sealed amphory in Hatshepsut's tomb, the falcon-carved jar Sinatip wouldn't open? Now, watching his precise movements, you understand why. The cat, who has followed you up the cliffs, pads silently into the shade of the shrine and curls beside the grinding slab, its tail twitching lazily. Sanut glances at it and mutters, Base-Tit's messenger, no doubt. By midday, the sun is harsh, hammering heat down onto pale stone. Sanitip packs up his tools, tucks the jar carefully into his reed basket, and gestures back toward the ferry. As you descend the cliff path, you glance once more at the sealed tomb entrances, their shadows deep and still, like doorways into another kind of time. Sanitip notices where you're looking but says nothing. Some things, you sense, are better left unsaid. The night after the incense testing, Wasset breathes in silence. The city, usually a chorus of traders, ox carts, children, and river songs, seems strangely muted as, if even the Nile has slowed its current, pausing mid-thought, you wake to the faint ringing of a bronze bell somewhere distant. Outside, the streets are lit only by a handful of oil lamps, their flames bending beneath a soft eastern wind. The cat sits upright on the windowsill, its back arched slightly, ears twitching toward the direction of Karnak. Senatip is seated cross-legged on the reed mat, already awake, the bronze censer in front of him. He holds a small clay tablet inscribed with narrow hieroglyphs, tilting it toward the lamplight. They've changed the formula, he murmurs without looking up. For what? You ask, still half asleep. The dream blend, he says softly. The priests want something stronger. The word carries weight in his voice, and not the good kind. Senatip sets the tablet aside and begins measuring ingredients with deliberate care. Powdered frankincense, crushed acacia pods, pine resin, and something new, a thin coil of translucent amber Senatip handles, as though it might bite. That, he explains when you ask, is imported from Punt. They call it sunstone. It burns hot and fast. You watch him work, his fingers precise, his movements unhurried despite the urgency implied by the bell still tolling somewhere in the distance. The cat leaps onto the work table, inspecting the amber coil with narrowed eyes before sitting directly in the middle of Senatip's workspace. Move, he tells it flatly. It doesn't. Bastet sends her spies and fur, he mutters, resigned, and begins mixing the ingredients around the cat. By the time the blend is finished, the scent has already transformed the era-layered sweetness threaded with something sharper, almost metallic. It makes your skin prickle faintly, like distant thunder. We'll burn it tonight, Senatip says, carefully sealing the censer with linen. At Karnak again, walk there feels different this time, heavier somehow, as though the streets are carrying whispers. You notice more small offerings placed outside doorways, bowls of figs, jugs of beer, palm leaves tied with red thread. Karnak looms larger than ever, the pylons casting enormous shadows under a full, round moon. Inside, the temple is alive. Priests move like pale ghosts, their chants deep and resonant, weaving layers of sound that vibrate faintly in your chest. Sanutip sets the censer down on a small platform at the edge of the sanctuary and lights it carefully. The resin catches instantly, the smoke rising faster than usual, curling upward like something alive. The scent blooms around you deep, warm, unsettlingly vivid. The air feels heavier, thicker. The chanting swells, wrapping around the smoke, carrying it higher into the unseen vaults above. Senatip kneels, murmuring a prayer under his breath, but his voice falters slightly, just enough for you to notice. You glance toward the statue of Aman at the sanctuary center, its carved obsidian eyes reflecting the wavering lamplight. Something about the shadows around its base looks wrong, not moving exactly, but shifting, like heat haze over stone. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptians truly believed the gods inhabited these statues during ritual, or whether the offerings were symbolic. Standing here, you have no doubts. Something is listening. Then the drums begins low, steady, deep, like the earth itself has joined the chant. Senatip leans close, whispering, "Don't breathe too deeply this time." The cat sits rigid beside you, ears flat, its tail wrapped tightly around its paws. You follow its gaze toward the smoke, which swirls oddly now, forming small, flickering shapes before dissolving again. For a fleeting moment, you think you see a figure woman, tall, wearing the false beard of kingship, but then the smoke disperses, leaving only its cloying sweetness. Senitip exhales shakily, mutters something you can't hear, and extinguishes the censer before the blend burns through entirely. Too strong, he murmurs, more to himself than you. Outside, the moonlight feels sharper than usual. Karnak's walls loom behind you, silent and immense, holding whatever happened tightly within them. Neither of you speak on the walk home. Morning brings no relief. The streets of Wasat buzz again, but there's an undercurrent to the noise, a restless tension you can't quite name. Traders argue more sharply, children are quieter, and you notice small knots of priests moving quickly between shrines, carrying bundles wrapped in linen. Senitip barely speaks as he prepares new ingredients on the reed mat. His hands are steady, but his shoulders are tense, as the perfumery smells thicker than usual, a dozen scents colliding in the close air. Finally, you ask what's wrong. He sets down the pestle, exhales slowly, and says, "Last night, something," answered. You blink, waiting for him to elaborate, but he doesn't. Instead, he begins grinding blue lotus petals into a fine powder, muttering to himself in low Theban dialect, too fast for you to follow. After a while, he stops and looks up. "We're going to Deir el-Bahari." The name carries weight you don't understand yet. The journey west takes most of the morning, following winding paths past cliffside shrines and narrow stairways cut directly into pale limestone. The air grows hotter with each step, baking the stone beneath your sandals. But Senitip moves with steady purpose. Eventually, the cliffs part to reveal a breathtaking sight. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple carved directly into the rock face. Its terraces rising in 3 sweeping levels. Columns lined like silent sentinels beneath the blazing sun. You've never seen anything like it. The air here feels different. Charged, maybe. The silence is so deep, it feels deliberate, as if the cliffs themselves are holding their breath. Senitip leads you up the temple's wide ramps, past painted reliefs depicting trading expeditions, processions of incense bearers, and ships laden with treasures from Punt. He stops at one panel showing rows of amphorae, carried by servants and gestures toward it. That, he says, is how the blend came to us. From the edges of the world, historians still argue about the scale of Hatshepsut's Punt expedition, how far they sailed, what routes they took, but here, seeing it carved in pigment and stone, it feels absolute. Senitip guides you into a shadowed chamber set deep into the rock, where the air is cooler, almost damp. The scent here is faint but layered old oils, faded flowers, dust settled thick over centuries. He kneels beside a small altar and places a single drop of oil from the jar you carried, whispering words too quiet to catch. The cat follows, curling up in a sunbeam cutting through a high slit in the rock wall. This, Senitip says softly, is where the last pharaoh spoke to her. Ka, you hesitate, then ask if he means spoke with or spoke to. He doesn't answer. Instead, he unwraps a bundle of linen to reveal a small amphora carved with spirals. Its wax seal remains intact. This, he says, was made before my time. My master's master prepared it for the queen herself. And yet, he pauses, thumb resting against the seal. It has never been opened. You feel the weight of that, the way time folds in on itself. Here scents preserved for centuries, waiting for the moment someone dares to breathe them back into existence. Senitip studies the amphora for a long moment, then sets it gently back onto the altar. Not yet, he whispers. Outside, the temple terraces are bright with sunlight, but the shadows seem deeper now, stretching longer against the cliffs. Somewhere faint and distant, you hear drums again, except this time, you're almost certain they're not coming from Karnak. That night, the Nile feels heavier than usual. You sit on the perfumery's small rooftop with Senitip, overlooking Wasat's winding streets, while the city hums below like a low, endless chord. Oil lamps flicker in quiet doorways, and somewhere far off, the steady beat of a hand drum echoes faintly against the water. Senitip has set the small bronze censer between you, but tonight, he doesn't light it. He just turns it slowly in his hands, watching the patterns etched into its surface, the spiraling falcons, the lotus blossoms, the tiny hieroglyphs of names and prayers that climb like vines. Do you know why perfumes matter? He asks suddenly, his voice softer than the breeze. You shake your head, waiting. It isn't just about smell, he says, leaning back against the low wall. It's about memory, about placing the ka in familiar surroundings when it walks between worlds. He closes his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, as though recalling something only he can sense. They believe, he continues, that scent carries more than air. It carries meaning, intention. If the ka smells the right blend, it knows the path home. Without it, trails off, letting the silence finish the thought. The cat climbs onto the wall beside you, balancing with perfect ease, and watches the river's dark surface. You notice its ears twitch at the faint drumbeat still carrying across the water. You hear that, you ask? Senatip nods slowly, his brow furrowing. Not Karnak this time, he murmurs. Dear El Bahari. Something about his tone makes you shiver despite the warm night air. The following morning, you return westward, following the now familiar path along the Nile and up the pale stone cliffs. The sun hangs low, turning the limestone gold, and the mortuary temple ahead gleams faintly in the rising light. But today, the terraces aren't silent. Priests move quickly along the ramps, their linen robes rustling as they carry small bundles into the inner chambers. The air smells faintly of resin and charred cedar, undercut by something sharper, metallic, like wet iron on stone. Inside, Senatip guides you past the main sanctuary into a deeper chamber lit only by small oil lamps. Painted reliefs cover the walls, scenes of processions, offerings, dancers, and strange gods with animal heads, but the colors are faded, muted by centuries of heat and smoke. At the center of the chamber sits a low stone table. Upon it rests the amphora Senatip showed you yesterday, its wax seal still unbroken. Around it, 3 older priests stand in silence, their heads bowed, as if waiting for someone else to give permission they're reluctant to grant. Senatip kneels before the amphora, his hand hovering over the seal. He doesn't touch it this time, just whispers a few words you don't recognize. One of the older priests replies in kind, their voice low and tremulous. Finally, Senatip looks up at you. We're opening it. The words sit between you like a stone dropped into still water. You want to ask why now, but something in his expression tells you this is not a question he'll answer. He takes a small bronze tool from his reed bag and begins carefully scraping away the wax. It flakes away in tiny curls, the sound almost too quiet to hear. The air seems to tighten around you as though the stone walls are leaning closer. When the seal finally cracks, a soft breath of air escapes, so faint you almost convince yourself you imagined it. Senatip tilts the amphora slowly, letting the lid rise an inch at a time, and the scent spills into the chamber. It's not like anything you've smelled before. Warm honey layered with cedar wood, sharp myrrh beneath, and something deeper, still, rich, resinous, almost metallic, like a memory older than language. The older priests close their eyes, breathing deeply, their lips moving in silent prayers. The cat, who has been curled lazily by the wall, suddenly sits upright, ears pinned flat, tail thrashing in quick, sharp movements. Senatip notices and hesitates. Something's wrong, he whispers, but the scent is already filling the chamber, winding around your thoughts like a slow, soft coil, heavy and soothing in equal measure. From somewhere deeper within the temple, drums begin again. 3 beats, a pause. 3 beats. The pattern is steady, deliberate. Senatip exhales slowly, reseals the amphora with trembling hands, and says, almost to himself, not yet. The drums stop instantly. The silence afterward feels alive. That night, Senatip doesn't sleep. You find him pacing the perfumery's courtyard, the small clay tablet from Karnak clutched in his hand. The oil lamp beside him burns low, casting long, restless shadows across the packed earth. They weren't supposed to open it yet, he mutters under his breath, as though speaking to himself more than to you. You opened it, you point out gently. Not fully, he snaps, then softens, pressing a hand to his temple. Not fully. If we had, the blend would have burned. He sets the tablet down and kneels, tracing hieroglyphs in the dust with the tip of his finger. Symbols for breath, for heart, for time folding over itself. It isn't just perfume, he says finally, glancing up at you. It's a map. You tilt your head, waiting for him to explain. The amphora holds a guide, he continues, not for the living, but for the ka. Each note, each resin, each drop of oilet points the way across the threshold. Historians still debate whether ancient Egyptians believed scent had literal power to guide the dead, or whether it was symbolic ritual. Here, watching Senatip's trembling hands and sleepless eyes, you feel certain it's both. By dawn, he has packed the censer, the amphora, and several small jars into a reed basket. "We're returning to Deir el-Bahari," he says simply, his voice flat, final. The journey west is silent this time. Even the ferryman doesn't greet you as you cross the river. He only nods, eyes fixed on the opposite bank, as though he doesn't want to know where you're going. At the cliffs, the temple is quiet again. Too quiet. The ramps are empty, the painted reliefs catching the morning sun without movement around them. Inside, the shadowed chambers feel colder than yesterday, as though something in the stone has withdrawn. Senatip leads you to the same inner room where the amphora rests, untouched since last night. The older priests are gone. Only a single oil lamp burns now, its flame bending slightly, as if disturbed by a current of unseen air. He places the censer beside the amphora and kneels, setting out the jars one by one. Lotus, frankincense, juniper, resin from punt. The cat curls near the doorway, paws tucked beneath its chest, watching intently with unblinking eyes. This time Senatip says softly, "We burn it." The words drop into the chamber like pebbles into deep water. He lights the blend carefully, and the resin catches immediately, releasing the layered scent into the air. It blooms quickly, more intense than before, warm and heavy, but strangely clean, like sunlight caught in amber. You feel it in your chest, first a deep, slow pull, as though your breath belongs to the room rather than to you. The painted figures on the walls seem sharper in the lamplight now, their outlines vibrating faintly at the edge of vision. One relief shows a procession of incense bearers. The smoke curling from their carved censers seems almost to move, almost to join the haze in the chamber. Senatip kneels lower, forehead nearly touching the stone, his voice threading into a low, steady chant. The sound blends with the crackling of the resin, rising and falling like waves. Then, for the briefest moment, you hear something else beneath it. Not Sanut, not the resin, not your own breath, a whisper. Faint, almost fragile, but unmistakable. You glance at Senatip, but his lips are moving silently, and you realize the voice isn't his. The cat's ears flick toward the amphora. The whisper comes again, clearer now, but still not words you recognize. Carried on the smoke itself, like sound traveling through water. Senatip opens his eyes slowly, as though waking from a dream, and looks at you. "It's listening," he says. For the first time since you arrived in Waysot, he looks afraid. The air inside the chamber doesn't move. The smoke curls lazily upward from the censer, folding and refolding into spirals so slow, they seem to take whole lifetimes to form. The oil lamp burns low, its light dimming in rhythm with your breath, as if the flame has learned your pace and decided to mimic it. Senatip hasn't spoken since he said it's listening. You can hear his quiet inhalations, steady but deeper than usual, like someone bracing for something unseen. The amphora sits on the altar between you both, sealed once again, its surface faintly gleaming with a sheen of oil, as though it sweats in the heatless chamber. The whisper returns. It's not louder this time, quieter, but closer, as though pressing against your ear without the courtesy of breath. You still can't make out the words, but you feel their cadence. The rise and fall like ripples across still water. Senatip places a hand over the amphora. "Don't answer," he murmurs, almost inaudibly. "You weren't planning to." The cat, silent until now, stands abruptly, tail puffed slightly, ears pinned flat. It pads toward the doorway and stops, staring into the shadows beyond the chamber. Its body tenses, a low, vibrating hum building in its throat. "What is it?" you whisper. Senatip doesn't look up from the amphora. "Not here," he says softly. "Not yet." Then the drums begin again. 3 beats. A pause. 3 beats. But this time they're inside the temple. The sound vibrates faintly beneath your feet, as though it's traveling through the stone itself rather than the air. Senatip rises abruptly, extinguishes the censer, and seals the remaining blend into a clay jar. His movements are precise, unhurried, but his shoulders are tense, his jaw set. "We're leaving," he says flatly. You don't argue. Outside, the terraces blaze under the afternoon sun, but the temple feels colder somehow, like it's holding its breath. You descend the ramps quickly, shadows stretching long across the limestone until you're back at the river's edge. The ferryman is waiting, as though he knew you'd come. He doesn't greet you this time, doesn't ask questions, doesn't look at the reed basket Senatip carries. Halfway across the Nile, you glance back at Deir el-Bahari. Temple is silent, carved terraces catching the late sun like blades of stone. But from this distance, you can still hear the drums. Faint, relentless. That evening, the perfumery feels different, as though someone's rearranged the air. Senatip sits cross-legged by the open window, grinding juniper berries into pale dust while muttering under his breath in a dialect you've ever heard him use. He says quietly, "We need to finish the map." "The map?" you ask, sitting opposite him. He gestures toward the sealed amphora. Each note in that blend points somewhere frankincense, lotus, myrrh, juniper their pathways. If we burn them in the right sequence, it will open. He doesn't explain what it is. Historians still debate whether these temple rituals were meant to awaken the Ka, or simply honor it, but sitting here watching Senatip sketch spirals and lines onto a scrap of papyrus, you have no doubt he believes there's more to it than reverence. The cat curls nearby, paw tucked under its chin, tail twitching lazily, but its ears remain alert, shifting slightly at sounds you don't hear. You ask Senatip if he's certain this is safe. He pauses, grinding to a halt, and looks at you steadily. No. For a long while, neither of you speak. Finally, Senatip sets down the pestle and says, "Tomorrow, Karnak." One last time. The words settle heavy between you like river silt after a flood. You wake before dawn, the perfumery cloaked in soft shadows, the air cool and still. Outside, the city hasn't stirred yet. Even the Nile sounds quieter than usual, its steady rhythm muffled as though wrapped in linen. Senatip is already up, packing small linen bundles into the reed basket lotus. Myrrh, cedar, juniper, each wrapped carefully and marked with single glyphs in red ink. The amphora sits in the center, its surface dark against the pale mat beneath it. "We're ready," he says softly, though the tremor in his voice betrays him. The cat trots ahead as you make your way through Wasit's winding streets, its small shadow darting across sandstone walls as dawn paints the eastern sky in soft gold. By the time you reach Karnak, the temple complex is waking. Priests sweep the courtyards clean. Oil lamps are being replaced with bowls of fresh lotus petals. And apprentices carry red baskets overflowing with offerings, bread, figs, honey, alabaster jars sealed with beeswax. But there's something off about the air here today. It feels heavier somehow, as though the temple is expecting you. Inside the hypostyle hall, the towering stone columns stretch upward into darkness. Their painted reliefs just catching the first touches of sunlight filtering in from narrow slits above. The sound here is strange. Every footstep echoes, folding back on itself until you feel surrounded by your own movements. Senatip chooses a small side chamber, low-ceilinged and cool, where the sound of chanting from the main sanctuary filters in faintly, like the sea heard from far inland. He places the amphora on a stone altar and unpacks the bundles one by one, laying them in a precise order: lotus to the east, juniper to the south, frankincense to the west, cedar to the north. "This," he murmurs, "is the sequence." He lights the censer, and the first blend begins to burn. Lotus first, the scent soft, floral, faintly sweet, settling gently into the air. Next, juniper sharp and clean, threading between the sweetness like cool wind through heat. Then frankincense, deep, warm, resinous, pulling the room downward, anchoring it somehow, as though gravity has shifted. Finally, cedar, earthy and dry, grounding the scents into something more than themselves. A shape forming without edges, a door without hinges. The smoke curls into layered spirals, denser than you expect, each note distinct, yet blending seamlessly into something larger, something cohesive. Senatip kneels, chanting low, each syllable deliberate, weighted. The carved figures on the walls seem clearer in the lamplight now. It's a pigment beneath centuries of soot emerging faintly, glowing where the smoke touches it. A procession of incense bearers, painted in ochre and deep blue, seems almost to move as the haze curls over their forms. The cat sits rigid at the chamber's entrance, pupils wide, tail wrapped tightly around its paws. Then you feel it pressure. Not air, not sound, but weight itself gathering, as though something vast is leaning against the thin skin of the room. Senetip's chant shifts subtly, his voice tightening at the edges. And you realize he's following something, adjusting to some rhythm you can't hear. Historians still debate whether Egyptians believed the Kié needed guidance to the afterlife or back from it. Here, now, you're uncomfortably certain this ritual does both. The smoke thickens until it becomes difficult to see the walls, the altar, even Senetip beside you. And in that shifting, clouded space, you hear the whisper again. Clearer this time. Closer, says only one word. Your name. You freeze. The smoke folds softly around you, blurring the edges of the room. But the word still hangs there, your name, stretched like silk, carried on air that shouldn't know how to speak. Senetip hears nothing, or pretends not to. His chant continues, low and deliberate, each syllable dropping into the stillness like beads of carved stone. You want to move, to speak, but the weight in the chamber is heavier, now thicker, pressing against your chest with slow insistence, as though the air itself wants you still. The cat hisses. Not loud, not panicked, just a sharp warning before it retreats to careful steps back into the hall. Fur flat, ears angled forward, pupils pinpricks in the dim light. Senetip finishes the verse, exhales slowly, and sets his hand on the amphora. His palm rests there as if grounding himself, but you can see the faint tremor in his fingers. Say nothing, he murmurs, without opening his eyes. You weren't planning to. The whisper comes again, softer this time, almost coaxing your name. Stretched into something unrecognizable, yet unmistakably yours. Senetip opens his eyes finally, steady and sharp. It knows you, he says. That's not comforting, you whisper back. He offers the faintest hint of a smile, dry as desert wind. But it's not meant to be. He reaches for the censer and adds a final pinch of lotus resin. The smoke shifts instantly, losing its density, thinning into translucent strands that curl upward like threads pulled from a woven cloth. The weight in the room eases, just slightly, as though whatever pressed against the walls has stepped back. Senetip exhales and sits back on his heels, the faintest sheen of sweat on his brow. It's listening, he says quietly, but it's not answering. Not yet. Outside the chamber, the chants from Karnak's central sanctuary swell suddenly. Louder, layered voices weaving over one another in an intricate rhythm. Senetip gathers the remaining bundles and reseals the amphora carefully, wrapping it in fresh linen before tucking it into the reed basket. We're finished for today, he says. You want to believe him? That night, Waset feels restless. The streets are louder than usual 11. After sunset, merchants haggle, children laugh too sharply. Music spills from open courtyards. You follow Senetip through the crowd until you reach the riverbank, where the Nile reflects the rising moon like polished obsidian. He sets the reed basket down and kneels at the water's edge, washing his hands slowly, carefully, almost ritualistically. It'll call again, he says quietly, without looking up. You hesitate, then asking if we answer. He glances over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Then we'd better be sure it's who we think it is. The cat curls beside you, watching the river with still, sharp focus, as if expecting something to surface from its dark depths. The next morning, Senetip wakes you early with no explanation. You trail him through wastes, winding alleys, until you reach a small courtyard garden, shaded by sycamore and tamarisk trees. At its center stands a shrine carved from pale limestone, worn smooth by countless hands. Small bowls of honey and figs sit before it, along with garlands of lotus blossoms, some fresh, some dried and brittle from the sun. Senetip kneels before the shrine and places a few grains of incense into a shallow clay dish. Offerings, he says softly. To whom you ask, not whom. He corrects gently. To what? The smoke rises slowly, curling into the soft morning light. And for the first time since Karnak, the air feels lighter, less strained. But only for a moment. From somewhere distant faint, almost imperceptible, the drums begin again. 3 beats. A pause. 3 beats. The cat opens its eyes. By midday, Senetip decides to return to Deir el Bahari. The decision is abrupt, but somehow unsurprising. You've learned not to expect explanations from him, only destinations. The climb west is quieter this time. The sun hangs high, beating against pale limestone until the light feels weightless and sharp. But Sanitip moves steadily, each step measured. The cat trails close behind, unusually silent. When you reach the terraces, the mortuary temple is empty. No priests move along the ramps, no offerings rest on stone altars, and the courtyards are swept clean, as though someone carefully removed all traces of ritual. The silence here is different than usual, heavier, intentional. Inside, the deeper chambers are cool, almost damp, the scent of resin lingering faintly in the carved walls. Sanitip leads you to the same inner sanctuary where the amphora waits, untouched since Karnak. He kneels before it and speaks softly, not chanting this time, just words in plain Theban. Can't follow everything, but you catch fragments. Pathways, breath, gates unsealed. Then he glances at you. We burn the sequence again, fully this time. You hesitate, but he's already laying out the bundle's lotus. Juniper, frankincense, cedar, in precise quadrants around the amphora. The cat sits in the doorway, tail curled neatly, gaze unbroken. First resin burns sweet and soft, drifting into the still air like distant river mist. The second sharpens it, layering something cool and bright beneath. The third deepens the room itself, pulling it inward, anchoring the body as if the stone walls have grown heavier. The fourth cedar binds them together, locking the scents into a single, spiraling current. The smoke coils thickly, rising in deliberate shapes now, less chaotic than before, as though drawn by invisible threads. Sanitip kneels lower, his voice threading into chant again. But this time the sound doesn't come from his throat alone. There's another voice, low, distant, layered beneath his, but not in harmony. Something older, slower, like stone shifting deep underground. The cat growls softly, tail lashing once before settling still again, as if holding its breath. And then, through the curling haze, a shape begins to emerge. It's not fully formed, not flesh, not shadow, but something in between, edges blurring against the smoke. It stands just beyond the altar, unmoving, tall, its head crowned with something you can't quite make out. Sanitip's voice falters for the first time, whispers, almost soundless. Historians still debate whether mortuary rituals were intended to invoke the pharaoh SK or simply honor it. But watching the figure drift forward, half carved from shadow, half woven from sentu, suspect it's no longer up for debate. The shape leans closer, the air tightening, pulling smoke into its form like breath. Then, without warning, the drums outside start again 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats louder now, closer than ever. The shape dissolves instantly, scattering back into formless haze. Sanitip exhales hard, extinguishes the censer, and grabs the amphora, cradling it like something fragile and volatile at once. Leave, he says, voice tight. Now, outside, the terraces are blinding in the midday sun. But when you glance back toward the sanctuary entrance, the shadows seem thicker, as though someone's still standing there, watching. The path down from Deir el-Bahari feels longer than usual. The limestone beneath your sandals crunches softly, but even that sound seems muted, like the air itself has grown heavier, dampened. The cat walks ahead of you, tail low, ears angled back, not fearful, just attentive. Sanitip doesn't speak until you reach the base of the terraces, where the sunlight settles warmer, gentler, and the temple's vast shadow finally falls away behind you. She's awake, he says quietly. Glance at him, but his gaze stays fixed on the horizon, where the green strip of the Nile glitters faintly in the distance. You're certain? You ask, though. You already know the answer. He nods once tightly. I saw her crest, he murmurs. The falcon pin. That was hers. The name lands softly, absorbed by the desert wind, but you feel its weight anyway. Historians still debate whether Hatshepsut's mortuary cult remained active long after her death, or whether Thutmose III erased her memory entirely. You're starting to suspect the truth is both and neither. As you descend into the valley, the sound of the city reaches you faintly. Market cries. Children's laughter, a distant boat horn calling across the river. It feels strangely normal after what just happened. Too normal. That night, back in the perfumery, Sanitip works in silence. The amphora sits on the low wooden table between you, sealed in fresh linen and bound with thin cord. He grinds small fragments of Kifi incense into powder, careful and unhurried, his movements ritualistic even when he isn't chanting. Finally, he speaks. It wasn't complete. You look up. The sequence, he says. 4 notes aren't enough. There's a 5th. He unrolls a scrap of papyrus, its surface covered in faint ink-lined scurved paths, spirals, overlapping circles. At its center, a glyph you don't recognize. A simple reed crossed by a single diagonal stroke, that he says, tapping it lightly, is Seshmet. A resin nobody uses anymore. Why not? You ask. Because it doesn't grow anymore, he replies dryly. Except, he pauses. Maybe where the river divides south of Elephantine. The cat lifts its head at the name, ears twitching slightly, as if it recognizes something older than words. By dawn, you're on the river again. The boat rocks gently beneath your feet, its woven red hull creaking softly as the current carries you south. The Nile here feels broader, quieter, as though the world is holding its breath. At Elephantine, the river splits around small rocky islands where sycamores cluster in tangled knots and ibis stalk the shallows in slow, deliberate steps. Senatip leads you inland, following a narrow path between sandstone outcroppings until you reach a shaded hollow where the air smells faintly sweet, almost fermented. And there it is. A single, stunted tree clinging to the rock, its bark pale, its resin thick and amber dark, where it bleeds from shallow cuts. Seshmet, Znitep scrapes a few drops carefully into a clay vial, his hands steady but slow reverent. This, he says softly, was hers, reserved for her alone. Then, almost to himself, it remembers. You want to ask what he means, but something in his tone warns you off. That evening, as the boat drifts north again, the sun melts into the western hills, casting the river in molten bronze. The amphora rests beside you, silent, wrapped, and sealed, and yet somewhere deep in the hum of cicadas, the slow lap of water, and the creak of wooden oars. You swear you hear your name whispered again? This time, you don't tell Senatip. Waysit feels different when you return. The streets are quieter than usual, though no one says why. Merchants still shout softly from shaded stalls. Children still dart between reed baskets piled high with figs and dates, but the rhythm of the city has shifted somehow. Like the collective breath is shortened by half a beat. The perfumery smells richer than usual tonight, the mingled scents of lotus and cedar hanging heavy in the air. Senatip places the sealed vial of Seshmet beside the amphora and begins preparing the final sequence without ceremony. Though his movements are slower now, deliberate. Once we burn all 5, he says quietly, the Ka won't just listen. You ask? He pauses, turning the reed basket in his hands. It will decide. The phrasing doesn't help your heart rate. Late into the night, the two of you prepare. Senatip sketches symbols across the perfumery's stone floor in powdered ochre and crushed juniper ash, tracing spirals that interlock and break designed to guide smoke into specific paths. The cat walks the edges of the markings, tail swishing, careful never to step inside. Finally, he sets the amphora in the center, unseals it, and lights the first resin. Lotus soft and sweet, curling around the senses like early morning mist. Juniper sharp and clean, threading through the sweetness, pulling it taut. Frankincense, deep grounding, resonant, pressing you closer to the earth. Cedar dry, steady, holding the blend together like a spine. And finally, Seshmet. The moment the resin hits the censer, the air shifts. The scent is unlike anything else. Metallic at first, faintly bitter, then blooming into something bright and unfamiliar. Halfway between crushed fig leaves and river wind, the smoke thickens almost instantly, spiraling upward into layered patterns so precise it feels deliberate, intelligent. Senatip chants softly, voice steady and low. And this time, there's no second voice beneath his. Instead, the smoke itself begins to move in response, curling where his syllables rise, splitting where they fall, like language made visible. Then, faintly, a shape forms again, this time clearer. The figure stands taller, more defined, the falcon pin crest unmistakable even through the haze. Her face, though obscured, carries a stillness so absolute it unsettles the air itself. Senatip lowers his head, whispering reverently, Nebatafru Hatshepsut.
At.
The cat flattens against the floor, pupils huge, ears forward, but unafraid. The figure moves closer. It's not walking, gliding, as though distance no longer matters. You expect sound, but there's none. Instead, a sensation threads through you, low and vast, not words, but knowing. Then, just as suddenly, the amphora trembles beneath the figure's faint presence. The linen wraps loosen, unraveling slightly, and the sealed wax seems to soften under invisible heat. The Ka isn't only listening, it's waking. Senatip inhales sharply, breaking the chant. The smoke falters, the figure fades, and the amphora stills once more. He exhales and sits back hard on the cool stone floor. Or close, he says softly, almost to himself. One more sequence. The cat looks at you, unblinking, as if it knows better. Somewhere outside, faint and distant, the drums start again. 3 beats, pause. 3 beats. Louder this time. The drums do not stop this time. Even after you leave the perfumery, even after Senatip seals the amphora once more and douses, it's a sensor, even as the cool night air presses soft against your skin, the sound lingers faint, but constant like a heartbeat just beneath the surface of the city. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. Waste is restless tonight. You feel it in the streets. Merchants packing away stalls earlier than usual. Doorways closing faster. Lanterns burning lower. Conversations murmur in half-finished sentences. Glances darting over shoulders like everyone's waiting for something unnamed. Senatip doesn't speak as you walk, the reed basket cradled carefully under his arm. His steps measured and slow. The cat pads silently at his heels, tail low, ears forward, listening for things you can't hear. Finally, when you reach the riverbank, Senatip stops, setting the basket down beside him. He stares at the black curve of the Nile, the faint starlight rippling across its surface. She's impatient, he murmurs. You want to ask how he knows, but you already do. By dawn, you're headed north again, the reed boat gliding across pale, glassy water. The eastern sky blooms in soft gradients of apricot and rose. The light spilling gently over Waset's clustered rooftops before melting into the desert beyond. Senatip stands at the bow, silent, watching the shifting currents as though the river carries answers beneath its surface. Finally, he speaks without turning. We can't do this here anymore. The air in Waysod is crowded. You wait, knowing better than to ask what he means. Instead, he continues, there's a sanctuary older than Karnak, older than Deir el-Bahari, older than anything they write on temple walls. Abydos will go there. The name hums in the morning air, faint but resonant, like something dormant stirred at its mention. By midday, you arrive at Abydos, like Waset. The city feels quieter, softer somehow, as though the wind itself slows to pass through it. The ruins here stretch across pale sandstone plains. Carved reliefs worn smooth by centuries, but still alive with color in shaded hollows. Senatip leads you to a temple half buried beneath drifting sand, its entrance framed by pillars carved with falcon-headed figures and curling lotus crowns. Inside, the air is cool and still, holding a faint sweetness like crushed fig leaves mixed with stone dust. Senatip sets the amphora at the center of a low platform where faint concentric spirals are etched into the floor. The cat curls against a broken statue, eyes sharp, tail flicking softly in slow intervals. We burn it here, Senatip says. You kneel beside him, laying out the bundles again lotus, juniper, frankincense, cedar, and finally, the small clay vial of Sekhmet. The first 4 resins smolder into layered spirals. Each thread of scent distinct yet intertwined, the air growing thicker, warmer, humming faintly like low wind in a deep canyon. Then Senatip opens the vial. The moment the Sekhmet hits the flame, the smoke changes finer, now translucent, almost luminous as it coils upward into braided patterns too deliberate to be chance. Then, silence. Even the ever-present drums vanish, as if swallowed whole by the chamber itself. The smoke gathers above the amphora, condensing slowly, patiently, until the figure forms again. This time, she's clear. Aketshepska stands before you, robed in faint shadow. the falcon pin on her headdress shimmering where the smoke touches it. She doesn't move, but the air shifts subtly around her presence, carrying something unspoken but heavy. Senitip bows low, murmuring softly in formal Theban phrases you half understand, invocations of protection, honor, guidance. Then, the sensation comes again, threading directly through you. Not words, not sound, just knowing she's not pleased. The Ka's stillness carries weight, heavier than stone, sharper than heat. Senetip straightens slowly, his palms open and empty before him. But his breath comes faster now, shallow beneath carefully measured calm. You don't move. The cat doesn't either, though its tail curls tighter, pupils wide as coins. Locked on the figure, as though its body recognizes something its mind cannot name. Finally, Senitip speaks softly. She's bound. The word hangs strangely in the chamber, heavier than it should be. She cannot cross, he says, gaze fixed on the smoke-formed crest above her brow. Something holds her. Historians still debate whether a pharaoh SK was believed to roam freely or required constant offerings to remain anchored. Watching this, seeing how the figure drifts just beyond the amphora, never stepping closer, you suspect the truth is neither simple nor comforting. Senitip reaches for the censer, sprinkling a fresh pinch of lotus resin into the embers. The smoke brightens faintly, pulsing once as though breathing. For a heartbeat, Hatshepsut's form sharpens edges clearer, folds of her robe visible, even the faint outline of her falcon pin rendered in fine detail. Then the floor trembles. It's subtle at first, more a low vibration than motion, but it travels up through your palms, your knees, into your ribs. Dust spills softly from the ceiling above. Senitip inhales sharply. They know, he whispers. Who? You ask, too softly. He doesn't answer. Outside, the drums return. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. This time they're deafening, shaking the low chamber walls, rolling like distant thunder across stone. Hatshepsut's figure wavers as though caught in a wind you cannot feel, her form blurring at the edges, dissolving and reforming in uneven intervals. Then the amphora begins to hum, not loudly, but steadily, low thrumming resonance. The sound of air vibrating against clay, as though something inside is straining against the seal. Senitip grips it tightly with both hands, his knuckles pale, jaw set. We have to finish, he says, steady but strained. Finish what? He glances up briefly, and there's no sarcasm left in his expression now, waking her. He scatters the last of the seshmet into the embers, and the smoke blooms violently upward, too fast, too dense, filling the chamber in a single inhalation. You close your eyes instinctively, but the sensation doesn't lessen the weight, the heat, the deep, low hum pulling through the stone itself. Somewhere in that darkness the Ka speaks, not aloud, not quite. The meaning comes directly unfiltered, quiet but absolute. Not yet. Then the smoke collapses, falling like water, and the chamber is still again. Senitip kneels motionless, hands braced on his knees, his breath uneven. The amphora rests silent. But you know, without touching it, without asking, that something inside has changed. When Senitip finally speaks, his voice is hoarse, threaded with awe and fear alike. She's waiting for us, somewhere above, faint but persistent. The drums fade back into silence. For now. You don't sleep that night. Wasit lies quiet around you. But it's the kind of quiet that presses against the skin, stretched too thin, holding something back. The streets are nearly empty. Even the wind has settled, unwilling to stir the air more than necessary. Senitip sits by the window, staring into the darkness beyond, one hand resting lightly on the sealed amphora. The cat curls against the base of the low table, tail twitching faintly, ears turning to track sounds you cannot hear. She said not yet, you murmur, finally breaking the silence. Senitip doesn't turn, doesn't blink. Not yet, he repeats softly. But soon. At dawn, Senitip insists on returning to Karnak. The decision startles you, though you no longer question his instincts. The path along the river feels strangely muted, the usual chaos of Wasit's markets dimmed by something unspoken, as though the whole city knows something shifting beneath its foundations. When you arrive, the temple is alive, with movement priests arranging offerings. Apprentices hauling heavy amphorae of oil, children sweeping the polished limestone floors with bundles of palm reeds. Yet beneath the routine, there's tension. People speak softer. Eyes linger longer. Senatip leads you past the hypostyle hall where the towering columns stretch into shadow, painted glyphs catching the pale morning sun. He chooses a small side chamber again, narrow and dim, where the distant hum of chanting filters in like water through stone. This time, the amphora isn't set on the altar. Instead, Sanut places it on the floor within a carved circle etched into the sandstone ring, marked faintly with symbols worn almost invisible by time. This, he says softly, brushing his fingers over the faded glyphs, predates Karnak itself. You kneel opposite him, laying out the 5 resins lotus. Juniper, frankincense, cedar, seshmet. The sequence is muscle memory now, but today it feels heavier, as though the weight of each bundle has grown while you weren't watching. Senatip lights the censer. Lotus curls upward, soft and sweet, a promise of stillness. Juniper cuts through it, sharp and cold, clearing paths unseen. Frankincense deepens the air, grounding body and breath alike. Cedar steadies the mixture, threading tension into balance. And finally, seshmet. The 5th resin hits the embers, and the chamber shifts. The smoke rises in deliberate spirals, more controlled than before, as though responding rather than drifting. Each coil threads upward into a layered lattice, delicate but precise, forming shapes too symmetrical to be chance. Senatip begins to chant not in Theban this time, but in an older tongue. The syllables raw and rounded, pulled from somewhere deep in the throat. The stone beneath your knees vibrates faintly with his voice, and then the air cools. Not gradually, the temperature drops, sudden and sharp, until your breath curls pale in front of you. The lamp flame gutters violently, but does not die. The cat presses itself low to the ground, ears pinned, fur flat. A shape begins to emerge again. Not from the smoke this time, but from the shadows themselves, as though the absence of light remembers her better than the living air. Hatshepsut's Ka takes form, clearer than ever, her falcon crest gleaming faintly, robes rippling, though there's no wind. Her gaze fixes on the amphora, not on you, not on Senatip, just the sealed clay vessel between you. The weight in the room grows unbearable, heavy enough that the air feels thick in your lungs, dense and slow. Senatip doesn't bow this time, he whispers, steady but quiet. Tell us what binds you. The knowing comes, sharp and cold, threading directly through the marrow. You feel it rather than hear it, not the body, not the tomb, the name. Historians still debate whether the erasure of Hatshepsut's name from monuments was punishment, ritual necessity, or political strategy. Watching her form blur faintly at the word, you realize all 3 may be true and worse, incomplete. She wants it spoken again, Sanit murmurs, voice barely audible, fully completely. You nod, though your throat is dry, so we say it. He glances at you sharply, eyes dark beneath the low lamplight. Not here, he says. Not yet. Outside Karnak's courtyards are flooded with sunlight. Far to the west, almost lost beneath the shouts of merchants and the soft slap of oars on the Nile, the drums return. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. This time, you're certain they're following you. The streets of Wazit hummed faintly beneath your feet. A rhythm you hadn't noticed before, a pulse hidden beneath the noise of daily life. The drums have stopped, but their absence feels louder than their presence. Back at the perfumery, Senatip spreads out 3 papyrus scrolls, their surfaces covered in faint lines of faded ink. The edges are worn brittle, as though handled too often by hands no longer here. These, he says softly, tapping the first scroll, are her cartouches, the royal seals they tried to erase. He traces the faint curves of the hieroglyphs with his fingertip, following where names should be carved but are instead chiseled smooth. She wants us to restore them, he murmurs, half to himself. Every glyph, every sound, every stroke. You lean over the scroll, tracing one faint indentation where the stonecutter's tool scraped away her name. It's shallow, imperfect, Rushtaz, though whoever struck it feared lingering too long. The cat leaps softly onto the table, nose brushing the papyrus, tail curling against your arm. Senatip doesn't shoo it away. She's more complete when the name's complete, he says quietly. Meaning, you ask. Meaning he says that we haven't been calling her back. We've been pulling fragments. For 2 days, you work in silence, reconstructing the erased cartouches from temple rubbings. Fragments of broken stele and whispers Senatip claims come to him in dreams. Each stroke of reed ink feels heavier than it should, as though every glyph reawakens something older than your hand. The cat watches constantly, curling near the amphora, but never touching it, its tail twitching in slow intervals, like it counts something invisible. Finally, the last cartouche is redrawn, its symbols dark and clean against fresh papyrus. Sinitz holds it up carefully, reverent, as though it's fragile despite the fresh fibers. She'll come, he says softly, and when she does, he doesn't finish the sentence. That night, you burn the sequence again, lotus first, soft and sweet, its curl of smoke drifting lazily upward. Juniper sharpens it, slicing through the sweetness like cool river wind. Frankincense deepens the air, pulling gravity tighter to the ground. Cedar steadies everything, grounding tension into balance. And finally, Sekhmet blooms into its metallic brightness, sharp and clean, threading the blend together. Senatep sets the restored cartouche at the center, beside the amphora. The smoke curls into precise spirals, folding inward on themselves like petals closing at dusk. Then she comes. Hatshepsut's ka solidifies fully now, robes faintly luminous, her falcon crest glinting where the lamplight threads through smoke. Her gaze fixes first on the cartouche, then on the amphora, and for the first time, she moves her form gliding forward, slow but sure, until her hand, pale and half-formed, rests faintly against the clay surface. Senatip bows low, murmuring, Nebatna fru Hatshepsut. The knowing floods back instantly, sharp and resonant. You hold what is mine? The amphora vibrates faintly beneath her touch, soft at first, then stronger, until the reed mat beneath it hums with quiet tension. The cat presses close to your leg now, its body taut, gaze unbroken. Senatip doesn't flinch. Tell us what you need, he whispers. The knowing deepens, quieter but heavier. Open it. You and Senatip exchange a glance. Neither of you speaks. Because the amphora isn't supposed to be opened. The amphora hums softly, as if answering her command before either of you can. Senatip's hand hovers above the linen seals, his breath shallow, gaze fixed on the faint shimmer of Hatshepsut's half-formed hand resting against the clay. Ah! Don't you whisper. She says open it, he replies, voice low, steady but frayed at the edges. She's not the one holding it, you counter. For a long moment, neither of you moves. The smoke curls higher, denser now, folding inward until the chamber feels smaller than it is. Hatshepsut's ka stands motionless, her form rippling faintly like desert heat seen from a distance. Her presence isn't oppressive, exactly, but she carries the weight of centuries like sand layered endlessly upon itself. Finally, Senatip lowers his hand, resting his fingertips lightly on the amphora's wax seal. If we don't, he says softly, she stays bound. The cat growls low, almost imperceptible, the sound rumbling deep in its chest. Senatip freezes, hand still resting lightly on the amphora, and you both glance down. The cat's body is rigid, ears pinned forward, pupils wide and thin. You've seen it like this only once before, Karnak. The first time she came. Senatip exhales slowly, pulling his hand back. We wait, he says finally. The ka doesn't move, but you feel her noticing the hesitation. The air tightens, the embers flicker, and a single coil of smoke trails sharply toward the amphora, as if tethered. Then, suddenly the drums return. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. This time, they're inside the perfumery walls. Senatip moves fast, extinguishing the censer, sealing the amphora again, sweeping the newly inked cartouche into a linen wrap. Pack everything, he says sharply. Where are we going? Abydos, he replies, voice clipped. Now. You don't ask why? The journey back south is silent, tense. The reed boat glides across the Nile's dark surface, the oars dipping and lifting without sound. Stars scatter faintly overhead, their reflections trembling in the water. Senatip kneels near the amphora, one hand resting lightly on the lid, as though steadying it or keeping something inside. The cat curls beside you, its small body warm against your leg, but it doesn't sleep. Its ears twitch constantly, tracking things unseen. At dawn, the sanctuary at Abydos waits, quiet and cool beneath its ancient stone archways. You step inside, carrying the amphora, the resins, cartouche, the tools, the burden, the weight of a pharaoh's forgotten name. Senatip kneels in the central chamber, arranging the resins in precise order. Lotus, juniper, frankincense, cedar seshmet. This time, he says softly. We open it. You inhale slowly, steadying your hands, though your breath shakes anyway. And when the last resin hits the censer, the chamber exhales. The smoke rises sharp and fast, spiraling into deliberate coils, folding into patterns so complex they seem woven. Hatshepsut's ka appears instantly now, her form almost whole, her falcon crest catching the faint lamplight as though carved from living obsidian. Her gaze drops to the amphora. Senatip places both hands on the clay, closes his eyes, and whispers, By your name, by your ka, by your breath. We open. The wax seal softens instantly, dripping down the amphora's smooth surface in lazy trails. A faint hiss escapes, as though air has been trapped inside for centuries, waiting for this precise moment. The lid loosens beneath his hands, and then, softly, the hum begins again. This time, it comes from inside. The amphora opens with a sound like a single reed breaking underfoot. Faint glow spills from within, not bright, not blinding, but soft and steady, like river light caught in polished alabaster. Smoke thickens, curling low before rising upward, drawn toward the shape of the ka as though feeding it directly. Senatip leans back, palms resting on his knees, his breath shallow but steady. The air vibrates faintly, the hum deepening until it threads through your ribs, the stone beneath you, the temple itself. The cat presses close, silent, unmoving, its gaze fixed on the amphora. Then slowly, Hatshepsut's ka steps forward. Her hand, translucent and luminous, touches the rim of the vessel. The knowing comes instantly, sharp and clear, threading directly through your thoughts. You have carried me far. Senatip bows deeply, murmuring in reverent Theban phrases, words older than the temple walls themselves, but her attention rests on you. You returned my name. The sensation carries warmth. Wait, something almost like gratitude, though beneath it. A hollow thread of sorrow lingers, older than memory. The glow within the amphora pulses once, twice, then softens to nothing. The smoke dissipates slowly, curling away into faint, translucent ribbons before vanishing into the cool air. Hatshepsut's ka lingers a moment longer, her gaze sweeping over the restored cartouche lying on the stone floor. Then, without sound or gesture, she fades, dissolving into the space between breaths, until there is only silence. Senatip sits back against the cold wall, eyes closed, exhaling slowly. She's free, he says softly, almost to himself. It's done. The cat yawns silently, curling against the amphora, as though to guard it anyway. Outside, somewhere beyond the sanctuary walls, a single ibis calls, its sound thin and bright against the still air. For the first time in days, you notice the absence of the drums. The silence feels different now, lighter. You sit with Senatip on the temple steps, the stones still cool beneath your palms, despite the sun warming the horizon. The Nile lies far below, its dark surface rippling faintly beneath the first touch of morning light. Somewhere distant, the breeze stirs palm fronds into a soft, rustling lullaby. You feel the weight of the amphora in your hands, not heavy anymore. It's just solid, quiet, emptied of whatever pressed against its clay walls for centuries. The cat curls nearby, its breathing steady, tail twitching lazily in dreamlike rhythm. Senatip leans back, closing his eyes, his voice softer now than you've ever heard it. She can rest. The words drift into the air like smoke dissolving into dawn. You close your eyes too, letting the hum of the waking city wash over you. Vendors calling softly to one another. Boats creaking as they push off from the riverbank, the faint splash of oars dipping into the current. The scents of lotus and juniper linger on your skin, faint but grounding, tied now to something older than memory. The drums do not return. You breathe slowly, letting the tension unwind from your shoulders, the stillness settling warm and steady in your chest. The stone beneath you holds the memory of every hand, every offering, every whispered prayer that came before, Now yours joins them, quiet and small, part of something vast and unbroken. Above you, the ibis calls once more, softer this time, its sound dissolving into the cool blue sky. You let your breath match the river's pace. Slow, gentle, endless. And the story for now closes with the quiet rhythm of the Nile, carrying its secrets downstream toward sleep.